January 25th, is that today's date? January 25th meeting of the County Board to order as we continue from our recess of yesterday, the 24th. And as you will recall, the discussion is now with the board on this item, number 33. And colleagues, to organize our discussion today, I propose that we first go through and look at all of the RTA topic areas that are under discussion and give you an opportunity to have any clarifying questions or conversation with staff. We have many members of the staff team here in person, which is a welcome sight, and I think we'll soon be joined by a representative of the Planning Commission who will also be available to participate in that discussion. But to just go in order, why don't we start with the maximum number of units per site to see if there are any questions about the options, 1A and 1B, or the general topic overall. Good, that one's an easy one. All right, why don't we move to the second one, which is minimum site area, and that is inclusive of options 2A, B, C, and D. Any questions for staff discussion? Mr. DeFerranti.
Yes. This question I'm confident but not certain I know the answer of. I did think it's important to ask. It concerns really 2A, 2B, well more, excuse me, 2B, 2C. It concerns, and 2D. It's my understanding, I think this is for our attorney, that under the request to advertise, and since we're scoping this, so we want to know what our options could be in March. If we elected to, for example, in 2B, if we elected to say for our 6 lots that we wanted a minimum lot size, and this is not likely because of, but we wanted to change that 9,000 square feet to 10,000 square feet at adoption as a minimum, would we be able to do that or not? The thinking, to give you, the thinking is that the thinking might be, and I've been considering this, would we be able to reduce the amount of density or the number of properties wherein you could have those, say, 5-unit dwellings?
Okay, so generally speaking, you could require a larger site area minimum because that would be restricting how much density could be created. However, what is in and outside of scope will really depend on which option you choose because the options are fairly complex and they're not limited only to site area. So it really depends on which lever you pull, I suppose, to determine whether or not it's in scope. And that's why we have 5 options.
Got it. Okay. That's helpful. I guess I just wanted to get the broader point out there and mindful that in each box, in each area of these, the specifics will certainly matter, but if we want to make change to allow less density, depending on the specifics, it could be allowable for us. Okay. That's really the only big question. I think we were going to just go through for questions, correct? So that's the question I had. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. All right, why don't we move, Ms. Crystal, sorry.
That's fine. At risk of prolonging things, I wondered if we could ask staff to speak a little bit more towards option 2D, which is, I think, a very thoughtful recommendation that you all have generated, trying to square the circle of the fact that we have two objectives that are to some extent competing, which is that the general appropriateness for more density in keeping with Arlington's general practice, has been closer to transit, yet it is also likely that the most appropriate places for more density will be areas with the greatest lot size. Could you walk us through a little bit more option 2D and how it refines the recommendation from the Planning Commission, which I believe is encapsulated in 2C, to address that desire to potentially distribute some of the density closer to transit while also being mindful of those smaller lot sizes?
Yes, for the record, Matt Ladd with Department of Community Planning, Housing and Development, and I will refer back to the presentation I gave on Saturday. If you'll bear with me just to share my screen. So there are four options for minimum site area in the staff report, and I believe, Ms. Crystal, you're asking about 2D.
Correct.
And you did identify the main challenge that we have here, which is that our lots that tend to be closer to our transit tend to be smaller than the lots that are further away from transit. And when we're talking about the number of units that might be appropriate for a site, or the minimum site area that might be appropriate, we also want to think about, we have some very large units that could accommodate larger buildings. So 2D sort of tries to circle that square a little bit, and if I could just walk through the standards there. So this would set for 2 to 4 unit buildings. The minimum site area would be the site area of the underlying zoning district, so 5,000 square feet for R5, 6,000 square feet for R6. And then there would be a greater minimum site area of at least 6,000 square feet, or whatever the underlying zoning is if it's higher, for 6 plexes, and then the same of 8,000 square feet minimum for 8 plexes. And so if you compare on our chart of the number of properties that would be eligible for different number of units, with the yellow being a maximum of 4, and the green being 6, and the blue being 8, it's sort of between option 2B, which would have most of the county limited to 4 units, and the Planning Commission's their suggested option 2C, which is 2B, but for transit proximate sites would be allowed to go to whatever the maximum number of units is. It's sort of a compromise between those two that would, recognize that we do have smaller lots near transit where we could have 6 plexes and 8 plexes, but also puts a little bit of a backstop to make sure that there wouldn't be 6 plexes on sites smaller than 6,000 square feet, or 8 plexes on sites smaller than 8,000 square feet.
Very helpful. Thank you so much.
Chair.
Mr. Carantonis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sure we will have a lot of conversation, Mr. Ladd, on all options the two options. I want just to understand a little bit the difference between, following up on the same line with Ms. Crystal. So did we actually, this is the pro forma feasibility on smaller lots close on 2C, the pro forma feasibility on up to 8 in transit proximate, but this is not really the reality on the site constraints are still there. So probably we would get, while the tall blue bar would be entitled, the reality would be significantly less, right? In big.
Right, that's correct.
larger.
Our analysis that we've done with the consultant, and then additional test fits of different unit types on different size lots that we shared during the ZOCO process, showed that larger unit counts just really aren't feasible on the sites of, say, 5,000 square feet. So this option 2C and also option 2A, which isn't shown on the screen, that's the option that would just keep the same minimum site area that we have for each zoning district. It really would be based on There's a maximum building envelope that you can achieve on any given site after you account for setbacks and lot coverage and height and all the other zoning standards, the parking requirements. And so under that option 2A or with 2C in the transit proximate areas, it would be, you set a building envelope of this is the size of building that the zoning allows, and within that, it would be up to the property owner to determine how many units would be marketable within that building envelope.
Yes, thank you.
Mr. DeFranti?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is concerning transit, and I need a refresher on premium transit networks. We currently have 2, is that right? Is it Crystal City and Columbia Pike? I'm just trying to get my terminology.
Yes, so the premium transit network is defined in our master transportation plan, which, as you know, is an element of our comprehensive plan, and it is the Columbia Pike and also the Route 1 corridor, Crystal City, Pentagon City, Potomac Yard.
So, and thank you, I did know it was an element, but I have not. I know we're updating our master transportation plan, but I clearly do not have memorized what premium is. If we added to the premium transit network, and I don't know whether this is probably a question that you may know, or also county attorney may know, or both. If we updated subsequently to our premium transit networks through the master transportation plan, would we need to, under our code, go through the RTA process and a zoning change type process?
So the way the text is drafted in defining these transit proximate areas it was first for the purposes of parking ratios, and I know we'll talk about that. But also the Planning Commission had suggested this option 2C that would rely on the transit proximity standard for minimum site area as well. So those are defined in the master transportation plan, and in the zoning text, it refers to those in the transportation plan, the premium transit network, the primary transit network. And so if the board were to adopt an amendment to the master transportation plan to change those routes, then it wouldn't be necessary to change the zoning text, but it might change people's entitlements in terms of what their parking requirement is within the zoning ordinance.
Great, that's helpful. I just wonder if it would result under 2D in an effective change in density. So just want to check, is that aligned with your sense, Ms. Kaur, and the county attorney sense of it? It's a reference, right? And if we need to come back to this, but I guess it wouldn't be a change, technically it wouldn't be a change in zoning, it would just be a change through the definition of EHO, so we would not need to do all the steps to advertise? And Matt, correct me, Mr. Ladd, correct me if I've gone off track. I'm just trying to think about a reference in that context.
So the reference is to the premium transportation network in the MTP.
Yep.
The MTP is part of the GLUB. So if we were ever to change the MTP, there would be a public hearing.
It would happen anyway?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Thanks for bearing with me on that. I did not know that off the top, so thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Any other questions or comments about minimum site area? Okay, why don't we move on to something that I don't think is very controversial, but we have 2 options for consideration of sites larger than 1 acre, 3A and B. Any questions or conversation about that?
I would
Mr.
like to.
Karantonis?
So the option 3B, which basically prohibits EHOs on sites that are bigger than 1 acre, except if, and this was part of the staff report if I'm not wrong, if they are submitted for a study, etc. That, do I understand it correctly? So the county board would have to be asked to initiate a process of studying these bigger sites?
Well, the county board would, so option 3A is, and this is only concerning sites that are currently
Use
large,
permit, yeah.
is currently larger than 1 acre. And so it would be an application process for a use permit, just like the county board hears use permits today. An applicant would fill out an application, and there would be a public hearing, and the county board would act to approve or deny the use permit.
But 3B is making it absolutely impossible. I mean, there is no provision, so nobody would say, look, I can have an HO development, subdivide the big site and come with EHOs as a proposal for a use permit. They would have to come to the county board and say, I would ask you to ask staff to study the site with a plan, a redevelopment plan, right?
Right. For that instance, an applicant could request a special GLUP study, an amendment to the general land use plan to change the general land use plan, and we have a process in place for that. That would be under option 3B, which would prohibit EHO development on sites larger than an acre, even with a use permit. The options for that property owner would be to develop by right one-family housing, or to request a special GLUP study.
Okay, thank you.
Just to square that circle on what I don't want to be inferring what Mr. Carantonis was leading to, but it doesn't prohibit EHO types from ending up on sites larger than 1 acre. It's just that the vehicle to achieve it wouldn't be through the EHO program. It would be through a larger study and review by staff and the board that ultimately permitted something to be built there.
Well, it would prohibit, option 3B would prohibit the standards for EHO development
Right.
from being applied to that site. It doesn't mean that something else couldn't happen through a rezoning or through other county board actions.
Right, but more to the point, it doesn't mean that on sites larger than 1 acre, you can never have some combination of structures built on that resembled what we saw under the EHO program. It just wouldn't be built according to those guidelines. Okay, thank you.
Could I add a question?
Ms. Garvey, yes.
But it's my understanding, if we don't permit it and it has to go through that process, that's much more cumbersome. Is that correct?
Yes, it's a much more cumbersome process to request a special GLUP study. It requires many community meetings with the Long Range Planning Committee, and it's not guaranteed that the county board would approve a change to the GLUP amendment, to the GLUP.
So it makes it much more less likely. Thank you.
Right.
Yep, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
But Mr. Ladd, to understand that, so in a use permit, if it's 3A, so the question would be, does the board agree to apply the HO standards or not? Right? So that's and if the board agrees to apply the HO standards, then everything else, like the setbacks, the trees, and all this would apply as in the rest of the HO standards. If 3B is the case, then the GLUB study could render more conditions or more, more design.
More community
consideration,
benefits,
yeah.
all the rest.
Yes.
Right, and I'm focusing on the GLUP, but likely what would need to happen is the county board would need to amend the GLUP. They would need to rezone the site. There would probably be a site plan with conditions. So there would be multiple county board actions that would need to happen.
Well, we are not going to discuss it. We are just exploring the outer limits of this, of this request to advertise. Thank you.
All right. Shall we move to number 4, lot coverage allowances, and that is inclusive of options 4A and 4B.
Mr. Chair, I have just a
Carantonis, please.
clarifying. We received testimony, and this is for our county attorney or anybody else. We received testimony that was asking whether we could substitute, for example, the detached garage coverage, the 5%, with something else, like, for example, compliance with the Green Home Choice Program, or, for example, giving a bonus still within the maximum limits of coverage for preservation of an old building. Is that an option, or why? What are the criteria to attach to this, to these 3 and 5%? 3% is very clear to me. It's about a porch, right? But 5% is for a detached garage. And one option, provides that. The other option incorporates that in the base density. is there any space to expand the 5% to other concepts?
They would have to be concepts that are traditional planning and zoning concepts that are within the definition of incentive zoning. So, you have lot coverage and porches are pretty standard site characteristics and layout of the house, but something more amorphous like the Green Choice Program, which is not in itself related to zoning, it's an environmental type program. There's really no nexus between that and zoning.
Thank you.
Ms. Crystal?
I was just going to clarify with staff as well that doing so, this is a question I think for our planning staff, doing so would also fracture the premise that EHO forms are subject to the same lot coverage requirements as single-family homes, correct? If we were to attach additional lot coverage to other objectives.
Well, I think that the way that we think about that is that there's obviously been a lot of conversation about lot coverage, and I know that we've raised in the draft forestry and natural resources plan the idea of doing a more holistic review of lot coverage, so that that might be the appropriate venue to focus any changes to the way that we do lot coverage outside of other options 4A and 4B that are before the board.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
So to clarify, we will have a second look at this at the lot coverage percentages when we discuss the natural resources plan, right?
I understand there are, we'll have discussions in the budget process on work plan and county board priorities. So if the lot coverage study, if we're directed by the board to make that a priority, that would be the process.
Thank you.
Yeah, I will just say for me, colleagues, I think that that's the best place for this conversation, though I understand the spirit of where this came from. Looking at EHO types as being less likely to take advantage of these additional lot coverage allowances. Is there another way to get some community benefit and give them more buildable area? But I'm also mindful that more buildable area is directly tied to affordability or attainability. And so figuring out that conversation to me is better left with lot coverage, but Mr. DeFerranti.
I just wanted to align and since we were on this, you mentioned there's a reusable materials also would be difficult to enforce as amorphous. I mean, things that are, we did have discussion, we did have testimony asking for, if we could allow, instead of the garage, require reusable materials. And I guess that seems to me both difficult to enforce, and I align with the policy point that you just made, Mr. Dorsey, but do I have that other consideration accurately described, or am I just sort of making that up?
I was only referring to Mr. Carantonis's reference to the, what is it called, the green choice or green home choice. As far as other things, I mean, I just haven't had the time to evaluate very specific proposals. So
Sure.
I can't answer it.
Well, then I'll just, since we're in this area, I'll just say I agree with your policy point with respect to reusable in addition to green home choice. Thanks.
And I would certainly imagine, Mr. DeFerranti, that it maybe not necessarily legally, but administratively, the permitting folks would have a big challenge with certifying reusable materials. Ms. Crystal.
That is vestigial.
No worries, no worries. All right, ready for parking? Okay, this is a big one. Got options 5A, B, C, D, and E. Let's see how far down the alphabet we can go. All right, any questions about the options presented thus far?
One question, if I may, Mr.
Yes, Ms. Crystal.
Do we know about the length of time that a parking study generally takes to conduct, review, and process? know we do this as part of our residential permit parking program.
This question came up during the ZOCA process. I believe the answer is about 75 days or so, but we have Sarah Crawford from the Department of Environmental Services who's going to probably correct me on that.
Yes, hi, thank you. Good afternoon. And for the record, Sarah Crawford, Assistant Director of Transportation with DES. That is correct. It takes about 75 days in terms of actual staff time in between those data points that are collected and then analyzed. We've anticipated roughly 12 staff hours that are necessary across that time.
Thank you very much. This is not one I've given staff advance notice on, so I understand if you need to get back to me on this, but do we know how long it generally takes to process construction permit for a by right redevelopment in a R5 plus?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. Can follow up on it.
I think that a lot of people complain that it takes too long anyway. Can I ask?
Before we leave this, I would love, while we have Ms. Crawford, to just drill down on that a little bit more, if we can. So about 12 staff hours, and can you just walk through what are the other non-Arlington County staff labor inputs that go into collecting these data? Can you just walk us through what the process kind of is?
So for the anticipated parking survey for Missing Middle, I can't answer that. Our staff for parking was not available to attend, so I don't have that granularity for the accessory dwelling parking survey, but we can certainly follow up and provide that.
Okay, because I think it would be, and if you can't hazard it at this point, it's okay, we'll live without it. It would be helpful to just figure out a total cost to this effort. Granted, it's not going to be borne by Arlington County, or at least is designed in the option, but it would be helpful to know that overall, and I guess you can't ballpark it for us at this point.
In terms of both the cost of staff hours and any potential subcontractor that's needed to perform the work?
Yeah.
Okay, so for staff hours, we have anticipated the parking survey fee would be similar to that for accessory dwelling units at $323. That's what's set already for the accessory dwelling fee. That doesn't nearly cover the staff time that's associated with conducting such a study. It's at least double or triple that. Depending on the volume of applications that come in and the additional resources that we would need to contract out, we would anticipate, I believe it's an additional 4 to 6 hours from outside sources, but again, I'd have to confirm that.
Okay, thank you. We can figure that out over the next couple months. Mr. DeFerranti first, and then Mr. Carantonis. Sorry.
I think you covered this part of my questions. I have another one on understanding primary transit networks a little bit, so maybe it's...
Okay, Mr. Carantonis, if this is in the ballpark.
Ms. Crawford, so for the residential parking permit, we require a parking study, right? Not always.
I'm sorry, for the accessory...
For the residential parking program, when residents request a residential parking program, assignment to their street to be assigned to the program, do we do a parking survey?
That's an extensive undertaking that would be above and beyond the level of parking survey that we're talking about today.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this would be far more complicated. This would be so the one that would have to demonstrate that the impact of a building through a parking survey would be a smaller scope survey.
Yes, the parking survey for this effort
Thank you, Mr. DeFerranti.
This may be for Ms. Crawford. It's about the primary transit network, which I think is a combination of ART and Metro bus operators. Is that right? Okay, and it goes north, south, and east-west. I think you were kind to share a diagram, and I don't know that colleagues may know it off the top of their head, but I just thought it would be helpful to understand what the primary transit network is as far as lines, or not specifically, but what it covers, and then how it would be changed. So magically, an additional person has appeared, so maybe you can phone a friend.
For the record, my name is Angie De La Barrera, and I'm with the Transportation Planning Department. And I'm covering the transit sort of oriented questions. So the premium network, it's the Columbia Pike and the Crystal City Pentagon City Transitway. It gives a high frequency bus service, which connects major destination and has a frequency of 10 to 12 minutes, peak and non-peak time.
Got it. And maybe primary?
Yeah, to expand on that, the primary network is a network that's outlined in our MTP. We have both the premium transit network and the primary transit network, both very similarly named, but different intent. The primary transit network is a higher density of bus service, both ART and Metrobus. It relates to the frequency of service as well as the number of routes that are on that. The map is included in the MTP map that shows which corridors those bus routes are on. And the service is typically at 15-minute intervals.
Great. Thank you. That's all I had on that.
Any other parking-related questions?
Sorry,
City
Mr. Chair.
Tranty? Sure. You said you were done, so.
So just, I don't know, to confirm, if we advertise 5A and 5C, if we ended up striking one of those categories, say primary transit network because of less frequency, or shrinking or decreasing the distance from a metro or perhaps from premium transit, would that be in scope to do if we have 5A and 5C as are in what we keep as our advertised proposal? I think it's for Ms. Corrigan, sorry, but it could be elsewhere.
Yes, as long as those are the only changes, they would be within scope.
Thank you. That's it.
Okay. Let's move to trees, tree requirements. Any questions about the options that are presented here? Moving on. I'm sorry? Ms. Crystal.
I believe staff had done some interesting analysis, and I wondered if they might speak to it about what the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Ordinance is 20% requirement with regard to single detached housing generally translates to in terms of number of trees and lots of different sizes, to help us understand for comparison's sake.
Yes, I do have a slide on that. Okay, so as has been discussed throughout this process, the requirement for one family or single detached housing in Arlington for tree canopy standards when a new house is built is 20% canopy, and that's measured for a tree 20 years at maturity. So obviously at the time of development, it's not 20%, but there's a chart that we have that shows for different tree species what that calculation is. And so we have calculated here for varying lot sizes, and again, this is the 20% standard that applies for one family development. 5,000 square feet would be required to provide at a minimum 3 trees, same for 6,000 square feet, and then as you get to 7,000 and 8,000 square feet, the requirement increases to 4 trees, and then 5 for 9,000 to 10,000 square feet, 6 trees for 12,000 square feet, and then to get up to 8 trees, you'd need a 15,000 square foot lot.
Thank you very much.
Any others on trees?
Just a
Aaron Thomas.
clarification. So if somebody just takes down trees that are on their lot and they are now far less than 20%, how do we enforce it? Are they in non-compliance with the Chesapeake Bay ordinance, and how do we enforce it?
I'm going to ask Vincent Verwey from the Department of Parks and Recreation to address that question. He's on the line.
Hello, this is Vincent Ferray, Urban Forest Manager for Parks and Recreation. This requirement is applied at development through by right development, and there is no requirement beyond what's typically the certificate of occupancy or the closure of the permit to retain those trees. However, I do want to dispel the notion that that means everybody just clears their trees after they get their building. That there's no either anecdotal or tree canopy assessment evidence of that. So there is no enforcement beyond the certificate of occupancy. Even if somebody just owns a property and went under 20% without redeveloping, there wouldn't be a repercussion for that.
Thank you, Mr. Verwey.
Ms. Garvey.
I think a question for a lawyer and probably for another time. Can we look into having some kind of enforcement? So if somebody gets their certificate of occupancy, gets in, and then immediately cuts down all the trees, we can do something about that?
That's defined by the Chesapeake Bay ordinance and statute.
And statute, so it's in Virginia code,
Yeah.
is what you're telling me. So we'd have to go to the General Assembly.
Yes.
Yeah, well, we might want to do that someday. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. DeFranti.
I want to just check for understanding with respect to the 20% and 10% pieces, because I think it was covered in a footnote. Did I read right, and I don't know, this is probably Mr. Verwall, that there's an acreage standard that applies to 10 and 20%, so it's, there's a certain number of acreage below which it's not a direct number of units test, it's a acreage test. Does that sound right? And I'm whoever can answer is I just think it's relevant for me to check that I have understanding, but also staff to understand, our community to understand if that is the case.
Thank you for that question. I can't answer that.
Go
It
ahead.
is either sites zoned business, commercial, or industrial are 10%. And then it's units per acre after that for residential. I will briefly share my screen, and the Chesapeake Bay ordinance, it calls out 10, 15, 20%, and it's units 10, it's 20 units or more for 10% per acre, between 10 and 20 for 15%, and less than 10 for 20%. So it is density based.
Great, thanks. Some instances I feel there are community members who have not quite seen or known that, and I also feel like it's important. Appreciate you just showing that on our screen. Thank you.
Okay, it looks like we're ready to move to annual limits. It's options 7A and 7B. Questions? Well, I'll start off with one. Just for the benefit of our public, can you give us a sense of the genesis of the number of 42 that is included in option 7A?
Yes, so that number refers back to our consultant analysis that was done during phase 2 of the expected amount of new construction that we would expect for missing middle housing, which was 19 to 21 lots per year being redeveloped. And so taking the larger number there, 21, but also reflecting that the consultant didn't consider conversions of existing buildings. So if you wanted to take an existing single detached house and add an interior unit so that it became 2 or even 3, we didn't do that analysis as part of the scope of that work. So without having a good sense of how many of those interior conversions we might see, we assume that there could be an equivalent number or 21. So the 42 is 21 plus 21.
And can you just give us a sense of the methodology that the consultant used to arrive at the 19 to 21 figure?
Yes, so the consultant, and this is detailed in the consultant's report that can be found on our website, but basically they looked at test fits of different missing middle housing types of all the ranges that we considered, including other ranges that weren't included in the phase 2 analysis, and compared the development costs and the rate of return to a prototypical single detached house, new construction that you would see on lots of varying sizes. So then they looked at historic teardown trends in terms of the lot sizes that are being developed, the zoning districts that are being redeveloped, and also, and so they considered the relative profitability of a missing middle housing type compared to the profitability that a builder would see from tearing down an older home and building a large 5 or 6 bedroom home. And based on that analysis, it was, in some cases, the missing middle housing types would be more profitable. There's also more risk involved in building the missing middle housing types. In some cases, building the single detached house would be more profitable. And so the consultants also looked at some early data that came out of Portland and Minneapolis, who had done similar zoning reforms, and the relative uptake of redevelopment that was happening in those single-family zoning areas, and what percentage of redevelopment was multi-unit development versus continuing to be large single detached homes.
So they essentially used multiple data points to arrive at that 21 estimate.
That's correct.
Thank you. Ms. Garvey.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, thank you. I think, again, just for our listening public, so if we take the option that you gave, the number 42, or another option at advertisement, and actually maybe this is more for our attorney, we advertise that, when it comes to adoption, we could set the number lower. The cap could be set lower but not higher. Is that correct?
Yes. Sorry, you're saying that you could set the cap lower.
When we adopt, we can set a lower number, a more restrictive number,
Yes.
but we cannot go higher.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, thank you. That's just what I just wanted people to understand that. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions about annual limits?
I have one.
Karen Tonis, please.
We received testimony that a cap would make more sense if it was somehow geographically dispersed, or, it would be not the same everywhere. And, there were differences of opinion how missing middle housing would, quote unquote, burden or put pressure in different neighborhoods. I hate the term burden. I'm sorry that I've even used that. So I don't think that housing is a burden under all circumstances, but the pressure is there. So can you tell us what are the parameters of such a fine tuning when we go ahead and consider that?
So this relates to our legal authority, so I'm going to ask the county attorney to weigh in.
So the upper cap is the number, and then what standards you would use to distribute, or what methodology you would use to distribute that cap, is at the board's discretion, assuming it has a rational basis.
It's just not to be opaque. I mean, none of this is a secret. So among options that have been discussed are to allocate caps among zoning districts according to a defensible methodology, and that is permissible.
Yes.
I'm asking the attorney, not
Yes, yes.
you. All right.
Definitely not one. So.
Mr. DeFerranti.
So related question, that I think this is where recovering as a lawyer is a disadvantage. So there is the spot zoning concern. So if we tried to do it based on specific neighborhoods, my impression, depending on the size of the neighborhood, we would be more at risk to those types of claims. Is that correct?
There are certain principles at play when you do zoning, like uniformity, and so a zoning distribution by zoning districts is general, and it's always been upheld. If you go into more specific criteria, you might be at more risk. I really can't opine without knowing the specifics, and
Yeah, and
I could advise you in closed session if you wanted more specifics.
sure, and I'm also mindful that both closed session is appropriate, but also I think there's a question that's been asked a number of times, so I just wanted to approach the area without getting into any more detail. Thank you.
I think it's useful to bring up, and I'll give you a hypothetical if you're comfortable asking this. So it would seem to me to not make a whole lot of sense to, or not make sense, forget that, not be defensible to ban EHOs, for example, in a neighborhood where the adjoining neighborhood with the same zoning districts, it's permitted. That would present, it would seem to me, a challenge to legally defend.
Yes, I mean, if they're in the same zoning districts, you would have to have a rational basis for why you treat them differently.
Thank you. Okay, are we ready to move? No, Mr. DeFranti.
Sorry, this is concerning the consultant's report. I think it's from Mr. Ladd. And I think this is the right place to ask it, but there's been a lot of discussion of the consultant's report. It was April 28th of last year. Interest rates have changed a lot, and you could make, it seems to me you could make arguments about the various income levels, 108,000, 118,000, et cetera. But with respect to the estimate that we just talked about, 19 to 21 instances, which extrapolates to 90 odd to 108, there may be more data since April 28th, but the analysis that the consultant went through at least still seems relatively sound to us. Is that fair? On the number of units?
Yes, that's correct. And I think you're also referencing attainability work, which I just want to be clear. The consultant's output was the cost of housing, either the price of a unit for sale or the rent of a unit that would be rented. And then staff's analysis that occurred in the spring was translating those costs into what income levels would be needed given various assumptions to purchase or rent housing at that level. So obviously costs change over time, but I would say that analysis is still fresh. Obviously interest rates have changed, and so attainability of a house at a certain cost has changed, but interest rates are always changing. And so, the considerations that we had made in terms of thinking about attainability in the spring with an interest rate in the mid-4s, I think it's likely we'll see interest rates in the mid-4s sometime within the horizon of this EHO adoption.
Great, that's helpful. And we've had debate about whether the number 19 to 21 would go up over time or down over time. The consultant's analysis was merely to say, this is what we think would happen in the sort of relatively shorter term. Is that a fair
Yes,
description?
I think that's fair.
Great, thanks.
Okay. Conversion of non-conforming dwellings as it relates to condos and co-ops. Any questions on those?
Mr. Chair, I have
Yes,
a
Ms.
question. It's
Carter.
just a general one. I'm pretty sure I understand it, but just to make sure we all do. So, like non-conforming, there are options A and B. If we advertise both options, we can advertise both options A and B, which leaves us the ability to adopt either one of those at adoption in March. Correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Just wanted to double check that. Thank you.
Thank you. And moving next, the definition of a duplex. And that is 9. Any questions there? All right, moving on. And this is where I'd love to get our Planning Commission reps ready, because I know that these are subject to some appropriate discussion there. So 10, options 10. So no questions from anybody on 9A and B, right? Just to make sure. All right, let's move on to 10. Any questions, comments? Would the Planning Commission like to offer something to frame some of your conversations on this?
This is about including established planning district areas to EHOs. I mean, that we can have EHOs in established planning districts like in Cherrydale, Columbia Pike.
Yeah, I just want to give them the opportunity since this was something that emanated from the Planning Commission, correct? Am I misremembering?
Option 10B, yes,
Yeah.
came from the Planning Commission.
We're just looking up 10B right now.
And I can speak to it briefly. So the, just if explanatory, so 10A, we're talking about applicability of where you would be able to do EHO lots, and obviously we're starting with the R5 to R20 zoning districts, and then should there be, within those R5 to R20 districts, any exceptions to that? We've already talked about sites larger than 1 acre. Another potential exception could be, we do have 3 planning districts that are designated on the general land use plan that overlap with that R5 to R20 zoning. And so these are areas like Columbia Pike has roughly 80 properties within the neighborhoods form-based code area. Cherrydale, there's fewer than 50 properties within that Cherrydale revitalization district. There's just a handful in East Falls Church. And these are areas that have, like along Columbia Pike, they have existing planning tools for redevelopment, like the form-based code. And so the question is, should we, should EHO by right be allowed when we have other planning tools for redevelopment that might be more within the bounds of previous community planning processes and board-adopted plans?
And so if you're ready, we'd love to hear why the
Thank
Planning Commission would like for us to consider those as part of this.
So I think if we frame the issue, we frame it within the kind of the broader understanding or context of some of the things that the Planning Commission is worried about or cognizant of. And of course, we've heard about this in the comments. So looking at our history, right, looking at who's been excluded, what the exclusion issues are just generally, looking at environmental issues, looking at increased housing, if we're doing this to make sure that we are increasing our opportunities to provide housing throughout Arlington. Also addressing those issues of the county attorney, the discussion between the board and the county attorney just now. We want to make sure that there are options for expanded housing options all over the county, no matter what stage in life you are. And I think the overall consensus for the Planning Commission, though we don't all have the same views on this issue, is we want to make sure that there is an RTA that's as broad as possible. And for us, that would mean that we would include additional planning areas, including Cherrydale. I think that there are some additional, maybe more focused conversations that Commissioner Weir would like to share as well.
Please.
But that would be kind of the umbrella idea for us, is just making sure that we have as broad a scope as possible that would include as many planning areas, including Cherrydale and East Falls Church.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry about that, Commissioner
That's
Patel.
okay.
For the record, Daniel Weir with the Planning Commission. One of the, there were a couple of commissioners, I think, who were very concerned about the equities in how this might prevent people living within certain neighborhoods that happen to overlap with where we've done a plan from being able to take advantage of the expanded housing opportunities. And also just, to sort of speak for the, and no one used these words, but I'm going to speak for the sort of keep Arlington weird aspect, right? There is a sense that there are good things that come out of quirky incidental changes that don't happen, right? And by allowing, by the Planning Commission, I think, was not sure that it would be a bad outcome if an existing single-family home were to redevelop under the expanded housing option, we weren't sure that it would be a bad thing if that would prevent consolidation of the entire lot under, whatever the planning guidance that part of the block might be subject to. It might create a quirky or interesting building that improves over over the long run the urban form. And I think that was an outcome that a number of members of the commission didn't want to see us preclude, at least not at the RTA stage. So
Thank you. Ms. Crystal?
Thank you for that insight. This too is one with which I have been wrestling as well. One of the things that I do want to make sure to get the context right, because I think it's times in the discussion, notwithstanding the Planning Commission's understanding of this nuance, sometimes the idea of excluding certain properties within neighborhoods has become substituted for an understanding that entire neighborhoods are being excluded. And so I just want to test with staff. My understanding, when we talk, for example, about Cherrydale and East Falls Church, it is not about exclusion of Cherrydale and East Falls Church. It's about maybe about 5% of the properties within each of those neighborhoods are the ones that we're talking about that are swept into a planning area. Is that right? Or is it a little more, a little less?
That's correct. So if you go to the general land use plan, the map, there are these dark outlined areas, and they tend to have numbers with them and the numbers associated with the note. So it would just be, for example, within Cherrydale, there's a Cherrydale revitalization district that is, hews pretty closely to Langston Boulevard, and there's about 50 or so R-zoned properties that are within that. And that's doesn't mean that the 800 plus properties within Cherrydale would be exempted. It would just be limited to those that are within the revitalization district.
It's really important for context. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal. I think, if this option is included, one of the things that we intend to do is to provide some explainer materials, and we'll want to make sure that that's quite explicit. Thank you for bringing it up. Okay, Mr. Carantonis.
So in this case, like Cherrydale, like Northern on Columbia Pike, et cetera, there is a real possibility that we have something that we have the same R zone, two properties, one next to each other. The one that would be an EHO, so it would be like a duplex, for example, and just the next door neighbor, because they are in a district that has been managed or planned this way, would not have access to the EHO option. And that the intention here, at least for option 10B, correct? So 10B is to provide a channel to manage this, obvious unequal treatment.
So I think the way that I would frame this is that under option 10A, those properties within those revitalization districts have an ability to redevelop under an existing tool like the form-based code or a rezoning that's set forth in the zoning ordinance or in an adopted plan. And it's a question of, should they have multiple options? Should they have the adoption to along Columbia Pike redevelop under the form-based code, or you have the ability to redevelop under expanded housing option?
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next, maximum gross floor area. For that, we have options A, B, and C. Is that right? Thank you. Mr. DeFerranti and then Mr. Carantonis.
So the question is, if it's for the Planning Commission Chair Patel, if you could give us a little bit of a sense. I think these in part, B and C, in part came from some discussions that you all as a group engaged in. And I guess it seems as though it's consistent with a sense to regulate less. And I wondered if you could provide any context for us briefly on that.
What'd you say? Oh. I think that it's not about, I don't think it's necessarily regulate less, Mr. DeFerranti. I think the issue for us is wanting to make sure that when we're thinking about these issues on like the broader scale, that we're not creating unintended consequences by over-regulating some things. So, where there are places that we could be a little bit more advisory, where there are places we could provide more help, we can provide additional conversation and not necessarily create regulatory requirements. We want to explore those first. Does that make sense?
Sure, so, and also perhaps, I'm not aware of whether we measure how often we get into measuring gross floor area on residential. I mean, yes, you have to have it, property assessment, but that helps.
And I think there was a lot of conversation for us as well as around even just thinking about gross floor area and whether we need to be looking at something else, but not to stop the EHO conversation.
Yeah.
Full stop by saying we're going to be looking at another scheme. That's certainly not what Planning Commission wants to do, but really wants to feel, we'd like staff to examine whether there are other options for us that might make more sense.
Sure. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Mr. Karantonis.
On options 11A and 11B, there are numbers. A duplex starts in range of 4,800 square feet and up to 8,000. And in 11B, there is duplex 5,000, triplex 7,500. So what informed these numbers?
So the standards in 11A actually were something that were put out in the draft Phase 2 framework back in the spring, and they were informed by the consultants' test fits and the work that they had done on designing different housing types on different lot sizes. And really, I think, staff understands the concerns raised by the Planning Commission, and that's why we're recommending advertising option 11C that would, take this away. But in terms of why we had initially put out option 11A, it was responding to concerns about housing, allowing for housing options, but in a way that we have seen, for example, semi-detached or duplex dwellings that have been built in recent years that were still 3,000, 4,000 square feet of living space. We know from experience in our housing market that if, even we heard a lot of testimony about 3-bedroom units and family-sized units, and we know that even with our committed affordable housing, I think the average size of a 3-bedroom unit is 1,100 square feet within our committed affordable housing. So trying to encourage these housing options, but not in a way that we're allowing or even incentivizing more 5- and 6-bedroom homes, but that are just attached to each other rather than being detached.
Thank you.
Mr. DeFerranti, still? Ms.
No,
Crystal?
vestige.
I was just going to, that's such an important point, well made. And I wondered if there was more, because I know you had done some of this analysis, Mr. Ladd. You were mentioning really the pretty massive distinction between a family-sized rental unit and the very large duplexes that may be sought to be discouraged here. And I know you've done a little more analysis. I don't know if you have off the cuff some of the examples of, the average 1-bedroom apartment, for example, in market rate, right? The square footage of older single-family detached homes relative to newer. These are, it helped me understand in any event what the max GFA proposal is designed to regulate and the scale of just how big even the maximum would be relative to other forms of housing that might be recognizable in the community.
I know in our research compendium that we put out in 2020, we had we do have figures on the average size of a home that's torn down when it's replaced. I don't remember exactly what that figure is. It was less than 2,000 square feet.
So I find that really helpful for consideration, that it is actually quite possible to get family-sized units within this cap of the max GFA. Thank you.
Okay. We're ready to move on to the last, accessory dwellings. Options 12A and B. again, invite our Planning Commission friends to let us know some of their thinking behind B.
Yeah, so this is, I think the planning, Chair Dorsey, I will say just the planning commission conversations altogether, you saw different sides of the coin, right? Everybody, I think there was common consensus, again, that we wanted to have as broad of an RTA as possible for us to be able to explore all of our options. ADUs present that same are in that same space. We want to make sure that we're as flexible as possible, particularly for spaces that have existing ADUs, making sure that EHOs and ADUs work together. What we're understanding is we didn't come anywhere close to the numbers or the caps that I guess that were on ADUs before. So it doesn't seem like this is going to be a pervasive issue for us. Nonetheless, there are certainly benefits that can come from making sure that we're able to include multiple units and have properties that can have an ADU on it that could be beneficial. So we just don't want to close down the conversation here. We want to make sure that there are options on the table, which is why you see this.
Thank you much. Mr. Weir?
Thank you. The only thing that I would add to Chair Patel's comments is I think with respect to ADUs specifically, and this might even be too elementary to a way to put it, but I think that there was a concern among a number of commissioners, including the commissioners who introduced the amendment, that we didn't want to accidentally preclude someone who has taken advantage of the work that you and the community has done to facilitate the construction of ADUs. We didn't want to preclude them from being able to, without tearing down the building and building a new one, which is also not an optimal outcome, to take advantage of EHOs. And likewise, there are reasons to, the reasons to have an ADU may very well apply to a particular unit within a duplex or a threeplex or a fourplex, and an ADU could be good for the particular people living just in that unit in a way that doesn't pencil out for them to say, well, why don't we buy out one of the other units in the duplex? Maybe what they need is the in-laws, and the in-laws don't need or have the resources for the whole unit. So I think that was the sort of equity concern that was animating the commissioners who were really the impetus of that motion.
Thank you. All right, Mr. DeFerranti.
I did have a question. I'm just trying to parse through option 12B and townhouse semi-detached. I count 3 and 2 in those cases, and I don't know if this is more for Mr. Ladd or whoever, but that is the description in red seems to me to limit this to 2 and 3 family dwellings, but I'm not clear because under B2 it mentions multifamily dwellings. So can you help clarify for me whether this is limited to 2 and 3 unit EHOs or whether it's open to additional EHOs?
Yeah, I think I can clarify that. So the definition of expanded housing option uses, right? We have 4 housing types that are encompassed by that. And so it's duplexes, which is 2 units up and down, semi-detached, which is 2 units side by side, they share a common wall. Townhouses are 3 side by side, they share a common wall. And then multifamily would be everything else from a triplex up to the maximum number of units that would be allowed. And so in the zoning text, in some cases, we recognize that semi-detached and townhouses are different because they're vertical, right? And they could be individually owned and subdivided in a way that the multifamily that are up and down would not be able to do that. It would have to be, if it was ownership, it would have to be a condominium or a cooperative or something like that. So getting back to accessory dwellings, and I want to clarify, the Planning Commission's recommendation was to allow accessory dwellings in combination with EHO in all cases. Staff, what we're recommending for advertisement would be only for the semi-detached and the townhouse units. And only, and I do want to clarify this, and only interior units. So that would allow, if you had a row of 3 townhouses or 2 side-by-side units, those could each get an accessory dwelling permit that would allow a basement unit perhaps.
Thank you.
Okay. I think we're now ready. If all question, no, you have another one, Mr. DeFranti?
I have 2 questions. They're not long. One concerns non-conforming. And my understanding I don't know who's best placed to answer this, perhaps Mr. Ladd, but it's non-conforming. There's non-conforming lots and there's non-conforming building structures. We just were talking about non-conforming building structures. Would you be able to describe what non-conforming lots are? Just so that, because it's in here, but for our public.
Right, so within Arlington County and within many jurisdictions, we have what we consider legally non-conforming lots, and you mentioned buildings, and there's also non-conforming uses. And the reason why things are non-conforming is because the zoning ordinance is amended over time, or we also know we have development that occurred prior to 1930, prior to when we had a zoning ordinance. And so non-conformities occur when the county board adopts a standard in the zoning ordinance that's stricter than the standard that was in place when that building was initially built or that lot was subdivided. So for an example on lots, if you take R6, the minimum dimensions for R6 is a width of 60 feet and a site area of 6,000 square feet. And so we have many R6 lots in Arlington County that were subdivided prior to that standard coming into place that might be less than 60 feet wide, or they might be smaller than 6,000 square feet. And so within the zoning ordinance, we allow those lots to be redeveloped. Currently, R6 only allows single detached houses. So if you could tear down an existing house, the originally built house on an R6 lot, that is non-conforming, maybe it doesn't meet the width standard or it's smaller than the site standard, you can build a new single detached house. It has to meet all the current zoning standards, but it doesn't have to meet those non-conformities.
Thank you, Mr. Ladd. Certainly, I know there's a piece of both 10, I think it is, and then earlier on, there's provisions in 2 on non-conforming, but I appreciate, Mr. Chair.
You said you had another one?
I did. Last question is concerning, Portland has an approach that for 6-unit dwellings, they require, I believe it's 2, it could be 3 of those units to be affordable at under 80% of area median income. My understanding is that under Virginia law and based on the approach to site plans and planning that we have in Arlington, we could not require one of a 6-unit dwelling to be affordable at 80% or lower or below of area median income, and we actually probably couldn't even request a contribution, or at least currently we could not request a contribution. I think that's a attorney question.
Sure. The ability of local governments to have an affordable housing program in their zoning ordinance is prescribed by statute. It is very restrictive, and the calculation for what you can ask for a developer in exchange for affordable housing is defined by a formula. And we've determined in looking at the kind of density that would be generated from these EHOs, it's very unlikely that they could generate enough density to yield anything significant.
Thank you, Ms. Court, and that's all.
And so just to put another way, Ms. Kaur, is it fair to say that in order to reach the threshold levels for which one could require an affordable housing contribution, the levels of density would far exceed what staff has proposed in keeping EHO in the low category according to our general land use plan?
I will have staff elaborate more, but the standard in the statute is 1 FAR, and I
Right.
believe it's unlikely that the majority of units we're looking at would exceed that.
That's correct.
We would essentially need to, it would be a whole different animal if we were to try and use this opportunity to achieve levels of density to get required affordable dwelling units. Go ahead, Ms. Crystal.
At the risk of being pedantic, I also just wanted to share an insight from the principal planners for the city of Portland. From as of the 4th of November, when I met with them, 0 sixplexes had been built. So if we did want to, even if we did have a legal pathway to proceed this, it is not proven, at least as of yet, in Portland to be a meaningful opportunity to realize affordable housing in their community.
And 1 eightplex. I think they got 1 eightplex. No, not even? Okay.
All right, but let's come back to our RTA. So, Ms. Crystal, I'm sorry, any other questions on anything? Even if we've passed the topic, if you want to revisit, any discussion, colleagues? If not, I think we're ready for a motion where we can then get into potential amendments. Go ahead, Ms. Crystal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move the county manager's recommendation that we adopt the attached resolution authorizing advertisement of public hearings by the Planning Commission on March 6th of 2023 and the County Board on March 18th of 2023 to consider the following general land use plan and Arlington County zoning ordinance amendments to implement the policies and regulations relating to the missing middle housing study in furtherance of the goals of the Affordable Housing Master Plan. First, amendments to the general land use plan, GLUP, booklet, and map to establish land use goals and policies that support a wider range of housing options in lower density residential areas as reflected in attachment 2. Further, B, an ordinance to amend, reenact, and recodify the Arlington County zoning ordinance, including Articles 3, 10, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 18, to establish regulations for expanded housing option development for properties zoned R20, R10, R8, R6, or R5, captured in attachment 3.
Is there a second? I will second. Now, would you like to kick off discussion on this, Ms. Crystal? Actually, you know what, everybody knows what it is. Why don't we get straight to it? Can we do that?
I'd be happy to do that.
All right, so why don't we go through again, just to make sure we capture everything and go through topic area by topic area to see if there are proposed additions to the motion which has been made and seconded. And for the purposes of this conversation, additions can also mean amendments to the text of any existing option, okay? So we're seeing what else we are adding to the discussion pot. And I will be brutally efficient going through this, so get ready. For one, maximum number of units per site. Any additions that we want to see there? Mr. DeFerranti.
Under the amendment standard to your addition, I
Okay.
think it would be, I'm going to move to strike option 1B because.
But that's a deletion, so why don't we hold that for the next go-round? This is, we're figuring out what's added to the pot before we take it away. The rationale being, if you consider them both at the same time, it may adjust your thinking on others. So first, additions or amendments to existing, will then deal with deletion of options in the second go-round. All right, seeing none for maximum number of units per site, we'll move to 2, minimum site area. 2A, B, C, and D. Any additions? Mr. DeFerranti.
I'm going to have an addition, which is 2E, which I can show. I think I've shared it with the clerk, but it would essentially add an option that would have 2 ways in which you would have a 5 and 6 unit dwelling, which would be very close to transit and above 12,000 square feet.
All right. So are we going to present it?
Sure.
Okay.
Do we need a second?
Yeah.
I'll second.
need a
I'll
second.
second.
Okay.
For that?
Seconded by Ms. Garvey.
Sure. So I'm happy to speak to this. The consultant's analysis of missing middle, as well as almost every person I've talked to has said that 8 and 7 unit, has said that 5 and 6 units have some benefits, but that they would be primarily 1 and 2 bedroom units. Of the 3 policy goals we articulated, I think there's one that fits. The first, under number 1, which is highlighted below, the first of this proposed option essentially takes roughly the standards in the parking section, but alters them slightly so that you would be eligible for a 5 or 6 unit dwelling only if you are within 1/2 mile of the Metro Rail station or within 1/4 mile of a transit stop along the premium transit network. So that's Columbia Pike and Crystal City. Number 2 here essentially does the copies standards from, I believe it's 2C, that allow for subdivision within individual dwelling lots. Number 3, which starts on the bottom of the page but continues onto the next page, essentially seeks to bring in the non-conforming standards that I think are in 2C. The bottom of B also is the second of the 2 main provisions that I mentioned, which says that a lot would have to be larger than 12,000 square feet if it were not proximate to transit in order to be eligible for 5 and 6 unit dwellings. The amendment as drafted does not include 7 and 8 unit dwellings.
Thank you. Any discussion on this motion? Questions, comments? Ms. Crystal?
If Mr. DeFerenti will allow, I would like to invite staff, which I know did some analysis, not dissimilar to the chart that you showed us earlier, Mr. Ladd, indicating the more or less percentage of the county that would be open to both transit and non-transit proximate, that would be open to the different forms.
Yes, if you'll bear with me as I share that.
Thank you. I found this helpful because I think Mr. DeFerenti's done really thoughtful analysis. I think it can be a little hard to visualize what the impact of that might be, and so I have found that application to be useful in my thinking.
I think that's it. So this is the same slide that I had shared earlier in the meeting and also during the presentation on Saturday, but we were given the text of 2E, and so we have mapped this new option 2E, showing, again, in the yellow would be where a maximum of 2 to 4 units would be allowed, and then in this option, the green would be a maximum of 6 units, and then similarly, we have the chart that I shared earlier with the option 2E showing transit proximate and not transit proximate using the option 5A parking definitions of transit proximate.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Mr. Ladd. And if we can just leave that up for a minute, I will say, with great respect for Mr. DeFerenti, I think this bar chart illustrates why I'm not able to support this amendment, even for purposes of request to advertise. I think it is possible that it represents a policy that would be worth pursuing. I think it is substantively a different policy than the one that our community has discussed. I believe that most of the potential for affordability or attainability in the near term is realized through fourplexes and above. We have seen that in the consultant analysis. I think there are, again, benefits to creating semi-detached and townhouses. I know that they will age over time into housing that is more affordable for more middle-class individuals. But certainly, we've seen consultant analyses that matches what we know of our market, I believe, suggesting that the 3 to 4 bedroom townhouses, 3plexes, for example, that would be really all that would be allowable in most parts of the county, would be well out of the reach. I think it forecloses most of the promise of this study, and so I regret that I'm not able to support it.
Thank you. Ms. Garvey?
But I am willing to support it. I'd like to have it there as an option. And I hear the comments that Ms. Crystal has made, and I understand that. As I've said in other times, I'm viewing what we're going to be adopting as in the nature more of a pilot, and I think this is going to be a work in progress, and this feels like a more gentle start into it, and I'm more comfortable with that. Thank you.
So if, Mr. Karantonis?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that it's a very interesting approach, and I understand that this amendment, the offered amendment, takes a lot of the initially potential maximum density out, but it also tweaks what is transit proximity. This is the biggest impact here. Besides the exclusion of 7 and 8, it's also the definition of transit proximity. I do think that in a way, in a path of looking at the implementation and how these EHOs will be propagating through the territory over many years, it's worth thinking about that. So for the purposes of the RTA, I would like to see this included. So I agree with the motion and have a very honest conversation about the actual impacts of that, because the bar chart gives us a raw result, right? It shows a very yellow bar at the right end, while 2C, well, I don't remember, 2C shows an old blue bar because we expanded almost the entirety of the territory to be transit proximate, which is not the fact. So I think as we are thinking this policy, we are thinking also about what how smart growth and transit proximity evolves over time, and where gentle density fits in the smart growth proposition. So for this reason, I think that the next 45 days or so will be helpful to discuss that.
So I am not inclined to support this, and it's not because I don't appreciate the thoughtfulness, but I do think that, and I'm going to invite you to give me a little bit of sense of your thinking here, but it's a different level of analysis than what staff brought with the original recommendations. Those were informed by detailed studies of sites, and we got recommendations that conform with that. Can you give us a sense of the basis for your numbers for what would be the minimums?
Sure. So, I mean, the part of the thinking was based on the last year of conversations that I've had about concerns relative to parking. I think that 12,000 square feet units are likely to have a frontage such that parking would be a reduced concern if you had 3 or 4 of these consecutively. So that's part of what led me to this. I also did look, I don't believe that we should exempt large lots from additional density. And so that's why the larger lots were, that's what led me towards the larger lots being eligible. I should note that the proposal would, for R20, it would be 20,000 because I wanted to stay where I could, consistent with what we had seen in the original staff draft. So that's what led to thinking that there should be a policy purpose for large lots. And the transit, I think you were asking about less, but the transit was based on an assessment that 10 to 12 minutes getting to a 10 to 12 minute frequency is what I find as truly transit accessible. I am more of an incentive-based modal shift person than a guilt-based modal shift person. And so I think that the half mile from a metro, I also, 3/4 of a mile in June, July, August, or September would be cause for a shower for me. And so that's also part of why I moved the metro narrower, and it's part of seeing and feeling that there's a reasonableness of what expectations might be for getting to transit. I don't know if that fully answers your question.
I mean, I guess what I'm looking for is really, I mean, at the end of the day, it's anywhere from a 20 to a 33% increase in required minimum site area. What would be my basis for saying that's the way to go versus what has already been included in the analysis for the options?
Yeah, I mean, I think this works out to a percentage of lots that seemed like a reasonable reach. And so that's one piece. But a second piece is there's been a lot of talk about gentle density. And I don't feel that gentle density is a 5 or 6 unit away from transit on an 8,000 square foot lot. So.
I appreciate hearing that. It does unfortunately reconfirm my position that I can't support it because it just doesn't meet the level of rigor that has been used to inform the other recommendations. And while I appreciate the sentiment and what you're trying to do here, I can't in good conscience say that we should bless something that is so disparate in terms of how it was constructed. So that is my piece.
Just so that, I'm not going to change any votes, but I did want to at least try and respond to Ms. Crystal and your concerns. Both, there's been a number of discussions in our community as a whole over the last year regarding this proposal. And I tried to ask that it be included in the staff piece, and it wasn't, and perhaps because there wasn't a rational basis. But I think that there is the conversations that I held over the last year were both inside this room and outside this room. And I don't feel that, I feel that it's appropriate to add this amendment as reflective of the full conversations that have been there. And so that's what I'd say with respect to that. I don't expect agreement, I just wanted to try to respond. With respect to affordability, I actually did have a question here to make sure I understand. There's a table, because you mentioned affordability as your other primary driver, Ms. Crystal. There's a table here that, first of all, we're not talking about affordable housing.
You can use the term attainable if you prefer.
Or I think one of our publics said capital A affordable, which is 80% or below area median income. But housing affordability is super important, and that's why I wholeheartedly support the direction that we're headed. The question is regarding what the impact might be, and there's a table that has 108,000, 118,000 that's in the staff report. And so the danger that is fair to worry about is missing housing affordability for those earning 108,000 to up to 124 or 140,000, depending on what interest rates do to things. Is 108,000 8 units? Because there's a slash in that piece. And wondered if you could talk a little bit about that table and help at least understand the band that might be at risk based on the amendment.
So you're referring to a table that we prepared during phase 2 when we did a lot of community engagement. And I think without speaking to specific numbers, in general, what our analysis found was that allowing more units on a site, because there's economies of scale within buildings, and also, most importantly, sharing the land costs among multiple units. The more units you have, the lower the costs end up being. So in terms of the 6 units and 8 units, those end up being the lowest cost housing. And also, to something that you said earlier, Mr. DeFranti, probably would be, not impossible that they would be 3-bedroom units, but in many cases probably would be 2-bedroom units or at least more compact units. And when we talk about housing, and we need a range of housing options within all of our neighborhoods, thinking about it, the size of the housing also has some bearing on the price.
Thank you, I appreciate it. So I'll just conclude by saying rigor is appropriate both with respect to the proposal, but also with respect to our confidence in the analysis that we received. And I'm not sure that I feel that most of these 5 and 6, most of these will be 1 and 2 bedrooms, and I think that that it is super important that we continue to add supply of 1 and 2 bedrooms directly in our transit corridors. But I'm mindful we have other things to do, and so thank you, Mr. Chair.
Case has been made. We'll now move to a vote on the proposed addition of Mr. DeFerranti's proposed 2E. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, please say nay.
Nay.
Here, the ayes have it, 3-2. This is added to our bucket. Let's move forward with number 3, sites larger than 1 acre. Any proposed changes to the existing or additions? Mr. DeFerranti? Turn off your microphone.
Oh, just did.
4, lot coverage allowances. Any additions or changes to 4A and B? Seeing none, moving to parking. 5, any additions to A, B, C, D, E? No, we're good? All right. 6, tree requirements. Any changes to A and B or additions? Ms. Garvey?
Yeah, I have a suggestion for amending option 6A, and appreciate the work the staff has done on this recently. And this would be that option 6A would provide that there would be a range of up to 4 shade trees for sites with 2 to 4 units, and up to 8 shade trees for sites with 5 to 8 units. I don't know where we'll end up on the 8-unit question, but for now we'll keep it at that, instead of 1 shade tree per dwelling unit. So this would have more trees, but it would be gradated by the number of units on the site.
I'll second it. Ms. Jacobs, do we have this in a way that we can portray on the screen? It's not that complicated, but if we do, be great. No, we don't?
I think
It's fine.
that might be my fault. We worked
Okay.
back and forth. I worked with our attorney, but I think Ms. Jacobs, I
All right, would you like
failed
to
put
speak
in
to
that
it, Ms. Garvey?
Excuse me?
Would you like to speak to it?
I just, sure. I think we all would like to have more trees if we could. We know there are some limits, and this seems to be a way of at least getting some there. We want to get as close to that 20% that's currently in the Chest Bay that we've got for the single-family houses that we've discussed quite a bit, and this would get us closer to that, and I think it would be helpful. So that's why I've got it. That's helpful. Just more trees. It's simple as that.
Thank you. I'm interested in this because I think, one of the things that we heard through the process was that the one per dwelling unit could approximate what is the existing Chest Bay standard for single-family detached dwellings, but wouldn't necessarily in all cases ensure that that happened. And this comes, I think, closer to ensuring that it would happen while not creating such a disparate condition with requirements for EHO that vastly exceed single-family detached. And to me, it seems like it's a fairly low bar for anyone who's seeking to develop a property to seek compliance. And, I very much am of the opinion that people who live in different housing types also very much appreciate tree canopy as well. And so to the extent that we can provide those requirements to do so without it being a disincentive to actually seeing development makes sense to me. And I think this gives us the range to consider that appropriately over the next 2 months. Ms. Crystal.
I just wanted to signal my interest in exactly what you've just teed up, Mr. Chair, which is to enlist the help of our staff in really understanding the feasibility of these greater amounts on different sites. I strongly agree with the sentiment motivating Ms. Garvey's proposal addition that more trees are always better for the people who live there as well as for the neighbors. Unfortunately, more trees aren't necessarily better if the projects don't get built. And so I think it's really important to the best we can assess whether this puts EHO development at any type of disadvantage relative to single family, which I think for all of the reasons we've discussed, anticipates still being the predominant form of redevelopment. I am mindful, actually, a rather colorful point made by one of our commenters that the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Ordinance requires the planting of trees. It does not require the retention of trees. And I think in some ways this type of development is actually likelier to lead to the retention of trees because it is not the decision of one owner. It is the decision of one owner or multiple owners, potentially in an EHO once built out and sold. And so I think we could actually see a greater retention of trees. I want to keep in mind that whole life cycle of the property, and so want to make sure that we're not disadvantaging these forms relative to their single detached counterparts. That said, happy to support this and look forward to gathering as much perspective as we can over the next 2 months. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Carantonis.
Thank you for offering that. I think this is directly responsive to a lot of comments that we got, and I think it's fair to attempt to put flesh to this regulation and to measure its impact. Like Ms. Crystal, I'm concerned there's an additional requirement. I do believe that EHOs actually have a better chance to maintain and quality tree canopy, which is really a difficult and expensive endeavor. When the trees grow, they need pruning, they need proper maintenance, etc. And I guess that more than one owners will be more capable of, middle-class owners will be more capable in investing in this tree canopy and enjoy the benefits of that. So for this RTA, I really thank you, Ms. Garvey, for bringing that forward. I will support that.
Mr. Chair?
Ms. Garvey.
Yes, I want to thank my colleagues for their support and for their more eloquent explanation, although I'll just sit with more trees. That's what I'd like. Thank you.
Mr. DeFerranti.
C, more trees. I've had plenty of words, so I support it and thank you.
All right, we can now move to a vote. And just remind everybody, we can also signify our support through our votes. So we don't have to say it all if there's nothing else to be said, even though I love hearing your voices. So on Ms. Garvey's motion to amend 4A to provide up to, if you can remind me of the numbers, Ms. Garvey?
Put on my microphone. Up a range, and that's the important part, okay, that there would be a range of up to 4 shade trees for sites with 2 to 4 units, and a range of up to 8 shade trees for sites with 5 to 8 units at this point, instead of the 1 shade tree per dwelling unit. And I'm not taking anything off the table, but this allows us to discuss that.
Right. So to be clear to everyone, the recommendation that was originally 4A before amendment could still be what is adopted, or it could be some other subset up to the range that Ms. Garvey just articulated. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it 5-0, and that is now an amended for option 4A. I'm sorry, not 4A, 6A. Thank you. We'll move next to annual limits. Ms. Crystal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a couple of items to add here, and I believe our clerk has that language for us. The first is a new option C, which includes 2 elements that would be new. One is a sunset on the cap during calendar years 2023 to 2026. The second is to, 3 elements. The second is to increase the annual permits from 42 to 58. And the third is to add the note that the method of distribution for the 58 permits shall be approved by the county board. I have a second.
Second.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I can speak to that further as we pull it up. First, with regard to the sunset, I think it is, or I believe it's my intent, it's been the intent through a lot of discussion that the caps should be a policy tool to ensure and try to minimize unintended consequences in the rollout of EHO development rather than a permanent curb on a type of housing that I think many of us would very much like to see. And so the way I have come to think of caps is that it is a fail-safe, so to speak, for what if the analysis of our consultants, the experience of the other cities who have tried this, our own experience with accessory dwellings, what if all of that is wrong? The market takes a hard turn on its heels towards this form of development rather than single family or single detached development, that a cap can be a fail-safe, if you will, for that. I do not, however, believe that needs to be a permanent part of our strategy. I think that the question beyond the first couple of years really is one of why, if we have put such care into thinking about how these types of housing will fit into our neighborhoods, and indeed I hope we will welcome them. I don't believe that needs to be permanent. So there is a sunset provision there. I have also proposed that we increase the number of permits to 58. It will similarly be my motion. I'll make a separate motion, I think, when it comes to 7A, We'll start with 7C, where we're just talking about additions. Notably, we have confirmed this with the county attorney. We can go lower on the caps, but not higher. And so I'd like to make sure their options reflect the maximum amount, knowing that if colleagues, the will of the board in 2 months is to return to the 42, that would still be an option available or lower. Reaching the 58 permits per year. This is simply another method of analysis. Staff has shared with us how they reached the 42. This is an idea that was first surfaced in Planning Commission discussions. One of the things we have talked about a lot is, and actually, in fact, I just referred to it, our expectation that single family or single detached housing really will continue to be the predominant form of redevelopment. I think the idea of capping EHO permits at about 1/3 of that annual activity is pretty consistent with the expectation that single detached housing remains the predominant form. Again, that is not, let me be very clear, that is not the amount of housing, the single family housing or single detached housing in the neighborhood. That is the amount of redevelopment on properties in that area, or through countywide rather. So in order to get a sense of the amount of turnover and redevelopment that is happening, I have taken here the average of our annual permits for new construction only, a 3-year average from 2020 to 2022. That generates an average of 175.6 permits annually. 1/3 of that would create an annual limit of 58 permits. The final point, just to connect that back to the earlier conversation regarding the method of distribution, there is some interest in potentially distributing those permits among zoning areas, or excuse me, rather zoning districts. I have included the math here not to in any way signal that that is what that would look like. In fact, I think there's probably a more sophisticated analysis to be completed, but simply showing how the math all adds up to the 175.6 annual average. And noting that we would like to continue to really make sure that any method of distribution we consider in March is a sound one, defensible. I think it probably makes sense to vote on that motion, and then I can also add them both at the same time.
Do A, because it's just a text change.
Okay.
To A.
So then let me clarify then that my motion is to amend option 7A, line 284 of the staff draft and add a new option C.
Still the second.
Thank you.
All right, any other discussion? Mr. Karantonis?
Just a question. So the new option 7C has the higher permit limit and the sunset clause?
Correct.
And it stipulates that the sunset clause is at 3 years.
Correct.
And I happen to agree with most of that. I think at 58 minutes. So just to give an idea of what 58, because this is a safeguard proposal, it will take about 48 years to get a 10% of total units, which is a little bit less than what McMansions have today in our land use. So it's still a very low delivery there. And I want to also point out that the PS study is extremely restrictive in its point in time estimates. I hope that we are going to see a little bit more of an interest, but I don't imagine that we'll have the tsunami-like turn of the market. Now, I have one problem with this, and I agree with the idea of sunsetting it. I think that future county boards will always have the possibility to extend that, to modify that, etc. But for any change, especially since we are doing this change in a economic period that may be a little bit challenged by interest rate change and other changes, I think a 5-year sunset is more appropriate. So I would either offer it as a friendly amendment, if accepted, if not as a additional motion.
If I may, Mr. Chair.
You have to determine whether you will accept it as friendly.
I'd like to speak too. So I do respect that. I think your own point, actually, Mr. Karantonis, leads me to suggest that I'd prefer you offer it as a substitute rather than accept it as friendly. Your point that that is a glacially slow pace to actually realize these at 58 a year, and so I think it would be appropriate for future boards, as you indicated, it will be very easy for a future board to extend the cap by either changing the time horizon or simply removing the sunset altogether if they wish. So I'd like us to allow this to be dynamic, to let the market evolve, and I would prefer the 3-year time horizon. So I'd like to put that to a vote of the board.
Okay, but before we can get to that, we actually have to vote on this one once we finish the discussion. So, Ms. Garvey?
Yeah, and I'm actually supportive of the substitute motion. I mean, it's just, you said we can have the 5-year sunset. We could decide to address it earlier. I think we've been putting the community through a lot. I'd rather have that horizon out a little bit farther and not have people start to obsess about 3 years out. I think the longer time period is better. I am fine with the 58 cap for advertisement purposes, and I'm very anxious to work out a method of distribution. And the final, my final sort of decision on what cap I would like will depend on the distribution and how that works. If we can't come up with a good distribution method, then I would go a lot lower. If we can come up with a good distribution method, then I may be comfortable with the 58, but I'm fine to advertise it. So I guess while I'm making these comments, can I second Mr. Carantonis? Nope, I will not. I will not. Nope. So that's where I am. Thank you.
All right, Mr. DeFranti.
Question. First, I support both in option 7C, moving from 42 to 58. I will also be supporting when we get to the amendment to 7A, moving to 58, in part because we can go lower, but also I think your points are on point, are appropriate. I agree with them. Just so I understand, I think the two sentences that talk about method of distribution, ultimately in March, if we were to adopt this, we would strike it and clarify what that means.
Correct. Yes, that's a really important distinction. Thank
Okay, so I'm supportive of 7C. I also am supportive of what I think would be the substitute in perhaps 7D. But I guess in this case, I'm just agreeable to everything.
7D, I'm sorry, what?
Well, if we have
It'll become 7C.
If we have a 7D with respect, if I support the sunset at 5 years, knowing that we can come down, and I know that's not what Ms. Crystal agrees, so
Yeah.
we would
Yeah,
get to that.
why don't we wait on that?
I was going to say, to clarify, my preference, just for purposes of being able to follow this over the next 2 months, if the substitute motion is successful, I would not argue that that needs to become a 7D. That can become 7C.
Okay.
Thanks for clarifying, yeah.
And to give my 2 cents on this, I'm happy to support this because I think it really captures the range of where this conversation is. It certainly doesn't necessarily reflect, how I view it completely. While I appreciate the methodology that Ms. Crystal has offered here, I'm not at this point willing to sign on to what has been the 3-year average being normative that we ought to base a cap on. I'd like to, think about other time horizons. I'd like to look at that analysis. There's a degree of, there's a degree of really thinking about this more broadly than I think a recent period, which has been different in many ways, as not necessarily being what we would want or expect moving forward. And so, but this is a number that we can't exceed, and I am very comfortable at this point saying that there is no methodology that I would look at that would want to exceed that. So this is perfectly appropriate. I think the cap, the sunset is also very appropriate for the period of time. We've all mentioned that this really is not a cudgel in a way. The board always, on its own prerogative, decide to take this up at any point in time. But I think we deserve, or our community deserves, to have the board look at this within a shorter time period to really check in on what's been going on, what the experience has been, what have we learned, what do we still not yet know. And the longer time period, while not fatal, just delays that work that I think is really in keeping with what we ought to be doing on an ongoing basis. So I think my support is for the 3-year sunset as well. Anything else on this matter before we vote on it?
One very quick response to your point. I think it's a very good one about it feels static. I just wanted to suggest, I did in fact look at single detached construction starts going back quite a few years earlier, they have been relatively stable around that average per year with maybe a swing or two around 2018. But I agree. I care too about making sure this is not just capturing some pandemic weirdness, to use a technical term. And it is relatively stable.
And to be clear, I'm not sure that actual activity is what I want to base it on, too. It's not just about the 3-year time period. But Ms.
Yeah,
Garvey.
thank you. And just to respond a little bit to what you said, Mr. Chair, I still would like to keep it at 5 for advertisement purposes. I might be persuaded to go lower, but I know we can't. So I'd like to keep it at 5 now. Again, I don't want the community obsessing about 3 and starting to check off the calendar. 5 seems like it's a little bit more open, but we'll see in the discussion in a couple of months where people actually are. And I do want to say I intend, when we get to March, which I hadn't meant to mention now, but I intend to be trying to put in as much monitoring and reporting back to the community as we can. So it's not like I'm planning to just revisit this in 5 years. I'm planning to be having lots of reporting as we go. So wanted to make that
In
clear.
order to get
Thank
to
you.
that discussion, I'll just suggest that we actually vote on this one. And then
Yes,
if there
let's
is
do
a
that.
substitute that is desired, we can do that. Can your comment wait, Mr. Karantonis? Thank you. So all those in favor on Ms. Crystal's motion to adopt new option 7C and to amend option 7A as presented on the screen, please say aye. Aye. All opposed, please say nay.
Nay.
Mr. DeFerranti, I didn't hear your vote. You're an aye? All right.
Based on the assumption that we can then go to the substitute.
Yes.
Okay.
In fact,
So-
you can't go to the substitute unless
Right,
you pass it.
correct. So by a vote of 3-2, that's Mr. DeFerranti, Ms. Crystal, and Mr. Dorsey concurring.
It's possible our colleagues may wish to reevaluate their vote. Did you know that?
No, well, no, I'm fine. We're going to vote again, right?
It doesn't matter.
It may matter for the record.
Do you care to revisit your vote?
I can revisit the vote, but I have to understand exactly. So we will vote again, right?
So you
there is
cannot
no problem
make
with
a
that.
substitute
Yeah, that-
until the
yeah,
main
yeah.
motion has been
Yes.
passed.
Right. So
So,
this could work
so-
parliamentary two ways. If this fails, then I expect one of you will offer something that reflected everything that Ms. Crystal just
So
said
for
with
the
5.
record,
Or this can pass and you can seek to amend it.
Since I'm here and I can do that, I am a yay on this.
You want to be a
A
yay?
yay, yes.
Okay. What do you want to do?
I'm just going to stay where I was.
Okay, so with Mr. Karantonis, Mr. Dorsey, Ms. Crystal, and Mr. DeFerranti concurring, the motion passes 4-1. This is now part of the main motion. Now I will invite Mr. Karantonis.
So the substitute motion would be verbatim equal with the previous motion, with the difference that it strikes 3 years and substitutes it with 5 years for the sunset clause for the limit.
I think you may wish that to be 2028.
I can put it on 2028, in 5 years from now.
Okay, so it is to amend what is now the amended motion where option 7C would read during calendar years 2023 to 2028.
Yes.
Okay, and Ms. Garvey, you would like to second? Is there any need to further discuss this matter? Good. Can we move to a vote on this? All those in favor of Mr. Karantonis's substitute to 7C, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And all those opposed, please say no.
Nay.
No, by a vote of 3-2 with Mr. DeFerranti, Mr. Karantonis, and Ms. Garvey concurring. That passes, and option 7C is amended to read during calendar years 2023 to 2028. All right, ready to move on to 8. Conversion of non-conforming to condos co-ops. Any amendments to 8A and B or additions? Okay, moving on to 9. The duplex definition, changes to 9A and B or additions? Moving to 10, applicability to all districts. We have options 10A and B. Any amendments to them or additions? All right, how about 11, maximum floor area? We have options A, B, and C, right? Any amendments or additions to those? Moving right along to accessory dwellings, we have two options, 12A and B. Any additions or amendments to those options? All right, beautiful. Let's get after it. Let's look at deletions. Starting with 1, maximum number of units. Mr. DeFerranti.
I'd like to strike 1B. I believe we should be considering just through 6 units as we go forward.
And I will second that.
Okay, motion made by Mr. DeFerranti, seconded by Ms. Garvey. Anything else you want to share as far as speaking to this motion?
Sure. The reasoning that I described regarding, in the last 2 months, we've approved projects with 1,400 plus units and 500 plus units in the corridors. I think 7 and 8 units are going to be 1 bedroom in almost every case. I think the consultant's analysis supports that. Perhaps 2 in some cases. I think that affordability can be served, often is analyzed as housing plus transportation, as we're trying to reach those making between 100 and 150 and 200,000, which is where this is. So I think we need to continue to try and address our significant supply problem as evidenced by vastly increasing rents over the past year through additional supply in the corridors. I also believe that 8-plexes and 7-plexes present parking challenges that are legitimate. I have had conversations with individuals where I think that we have fair concerns about parking if you have 2 or 3. Even if you have 1, there are parking questions that I think are legitimate and not just we don't want density in our own neighborhood. We have to transform our housing network. I think there are 3 purposes identified in September 20th, and flexibility is a valid one, but I think the costs of 8 and 7 for our discussion outweigh the benefits, and have an additional, I'm sure we'll have discussion, that's a start as to my reasoning as to why I think we should strike 7 and 8-plexes at this stage.
Okay, other perspectives? I'll recognize myself while we're waiting. You know, I appreciate that, and it seems to me to be a legitimate policy basis to base one's final decision on. I'm not sure that I adopt the thinking that it ought to be removed at this point from advertisement. It seems that we have had extensive discussion about this concept, looking at 7 and 8s. It is not, in my opinion, there's no threshold that has been met that should disqualify it from continued conversation. And certainly, as I've tried to do, or as I'm going to try to do with all areas of this RTA, anything that stands reasonable basis for being proposed and a reasonable basis for being considered ought not to be excluded at this point. That to me seems arbitrary and capricious, so I cannot support this motion, understanding though that the ultimate adoption may merit a different view on some of the policy considerations that you brought up. I'm just not ready to make that decision now without having the benefit of the next 2 months. Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. I intend to support the motion. And one of the reasons is, at this point, this is by right, 7 and 8 is a class of development that is relatively difficult to fit right now in many neighborhoods, and mostly in the neighborhoods that are in proximity, close proximity to transit. It has many impacts. It is difficult to manage. It has generated a lot of comments and a lot of focus from the community that I believe takes away from the very legitimate conversation about lower hanging, attainable results here. I fully appreciate the intention of putting everything on the table. But at some point, we have to decide whether putting everything on the table is not dispersing the conversation into many channels. We have already a very big variety of issues here. And I think that in general, gentle density in its first implementation phase will be better served if we discuss the options from 2 to 6 rather than go all the way up to 8. It is a different class of building. It has a different urbanism. It is definitely, and I agree, and I will be the first to agree, that it's the most affordable for us. No question about that. We have seen that. It's also because it distributes the land, the high price of the land on more units. It's also very efficient, more efficient than others, than other EHOs. But at this point, I think that it is a class of building that we want to see at a later review and after having seen how the zoning reform works. It should be on the table, but not in this RTA.
Ms. Garvey.
Thank you. I think I will say essentially what Mr. Carantonis said, although in a slightly different way, because it's me. I feel like we've been talking about this a lot. And I am frankly tired of talking about 7 and 8 plexes because people are so upset that's what gets thrown out all of the time. And I feel it's taken away from the discussion. I feel we've talked it to death practically. And I understand the desire to continue to consider it, but I feel like the conversation from here until March will be better and more focused. And I think it will help bring down some of the distress in the community if we at this point signal that we're not going above 6. So that's why I'm pleased to support this. Thank you.
Ms. Crystal.
I actually wasn't going to speak, Mr. Chair, because I thought you summarized my points really nicely. I too think that perhaps landing at 6 plexes may very well be the appropriate place to be in March. I think it will prove profoundly naive for us to imagine that we are going to in some way reach consensus on an issue that has exposed a great majority of opinions and or great dissimilarity of opinions in our community to curtail the conversation at this point. I think it is a little bit of a fool's errand to chase that notion. I would be delighted to be proven wrong if we can have a more constructive conversation over the next 2 months as a result. But I think that it is precluding meaningful analysis by this board out of the false hope that it will somehow change the tenor of a conversation.
Hey, Mr. DeFranti, and another go-round.
I won't be long. I just will say that you may be right. And yet I believe that there are others for whom there's openness. And I think it's an unknowable question at this moment, how many others there are. There's some, ultimately I feel I'm committed to try to work to build consensus, not unanimity. We're not going to have that. But I'm mindful that some Arlingtons are going to be imposed regardless of whether 8 plexes or 7 plexes are included, and there's some who are going to be supportive no matter what. That's my sense. So I think it's consistent with what I heard from a lot of people over the last year. I think it's reasonable, and I think it's time to take this step now to move forward to a more focused conversation. I should say that I also believe that this can best serve the goal of having 5 and 6 plexes be sustainable for outside of transit corridors over the long term. So those are my reasons. And I don't mean to close conversation. I just wanted to share those thoughts.
And I'll take a round 2 since you did. Whatever your goals for wanting to propose limiting it here, I'll just comment a little bit on the public discourse that we've had thus far. Despite the extensive analysis that has shown the limited viability of 7 and 8 plexes, and that are that are further limited by the options that have been presented with minimum site area for 2A and for options 2, we still hear apocalyptic concerns about 7 and 8 plexes on every block. And we're going to hear it about 5 and 6 plexes on every parcel. So while I don't want to call you naive, I want to just also say that the conversation about 7 and 8s everywhere has already been, I'll be generous, based on a lack of understanding. And we do nothing to further that understanding by simply taking it off the table and punting. But I hear you all, and we've said what needs to be said. Oh, it looks like everybody else wants a crack at round two.
Well,
as
at my age, to be called naive is kind of fun. So that's great.
Yeah, I'm not calling you naive. I'm calling the idea naive.
Well, I'm supporting the idea. You can call me naive. It's all right. I don't think we're going to agree. I don't think we're going to get consensus. I will say that. I believe that we'll come to what I think is the Goldilocks solution in every difficult plan in the end when we get to March, which I've often said, nobody's going to be happy. And in fact, if either the real strong proponents or the opponents, either side is happy, we will have failed, I think. And as I say, I mean, some of this is just personal. I am tired of talking about 7 and 8s. I know I'm not going to get there. I really just don't want to talk about that anymore. And I expect there will be difficult conversations, but I want them to be through 1 through 6. I don't want to be talking about 7 and 8s anymore. So that's where I am. It's all about me in some ways. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Karantonis, anything to add?
Mr. Chair, I'm not really personally, I'm not really responsive to the hype and, the discussion. I just yesterday in Open Door Monday had a resident who thought that her cul-de-sac will be 5 by 8 tomorrow. I don't respond to that. This is not my concern. My concern is to focus the work on the next 45, 50 days on a pragmatic scale of solutions, of EHOs, to make reform really viable and make it in its first phase of implementation, these first 5 years, et cetera, a successful proposition, instead of having to fight with units and examples and potential projects that will bring more problems than they will bring solutions at this point where we are just starting. Thank you.
Okay, it looks like it has all been said, and we'll now move to a vote on Mr. DeFerranti's motion to remove option 1. Make sure I'm remembering it. It's to remove option 1B, right?
B, it's to strike
Right.
1B.
To go up to 8 units and instead have one option for maximum number of units, which will be 1A. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, please say no. No. The ayes have it with Mr. DeFerranti, Mr. Karantonis, and Ms. Garvey concurring. We'll now look to deletions for number 2, minimum site area. Where, just to remind you all, we now have options 2A, B, C, D, and E. Now move to number 3, sites larger than 1 acre. We have any proposed deletions? Ms. Crystal.
Mr. Chair, please, if I could ask our clerk to pull this up. I move that we strike line 151, which is to say option 3B. That is the option that would disallow EHO development under site plan.
Second.
Thank you. I don't know that this needs extensive commentary, except to say, when we seek areas of consensus, even those I think who are most opposed to EHO development by right have suggested they would like to see it under site plan or special exception. I think we actually, in fact, heard from a opponent of the overall ordinance amendment this weekend suggest that, for example, the February Lothrop House, which would be illustrative of this, would have been an appropriate place to consider special exception. Of course, that takes a willing owner, which we did not have in that case. But in future cases, when we do have a willing owner, I think the idea of allowing for a special exception process is perfectly appropriate. I don't think there is a constituency for this option, and I think we could probably streamline our efforts going forward to remove it.
All right. Any further discussion? Mr. DeFerranti.
Full agreement. I just would like to say that if you include area of lot as something that is a component of what should be missing middle, I don't see how I could vote to not have that option available for greater than 1 acre. I just don't see that. So full support. Thanks.
Let's make it easy. Let's move to a vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it 5-0. Option 3B is removed. Let's move to 4, lot coverage allowances. Any deletions proposed for 4A or 4B? Moving to 5, parking. We have options A, B, C, D, and E.
I would like
Mr.
to move.
Karantonis?
Mr. Chair, I would like to move to strike line 212, option 5D, like Denmark. That is an option of no minimum parking requirements in all our districts, so no minimum parking requirements across the board.
Okay, so proposal to strike the option
this.
5D, which would not have any parking minimums at all, seconded by Mr. DeFerranti. Would you like to further speak to it?
Yes, so I fully appreciate the discussion about that, and I'm somebody who has been quoted many times arguing against parking minimums and for parking maximums in general. In all developed places, I think we should be moving towards there. This is a huge policy shift. I think Arlington is moving already in the right direction. We have been doing this in our corridors. We have been constantly reducing our parking minimums. We should be doing that, and we should be doing that with EHOs, especially when we are in transit proximity. And maybe, the other options offer a lot of possibilities. I understand also that parking is one of the most restrictive determinants of success for EHOs as we go ahead. However, to spend the time and energy to work on a significant, in my opinion, policy shift to evaluate the disappearance of parking minimum requirements in all districts is, for me, one more item that will have a place at some point in the future, but not in this RTA. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. DeFerranti.
I support this as consistent with trying to have a conversation that aligns with where I thought we were in July at the work session. We asked for additional options for parking, and saying zero is, I don't think, there are probably planning commissioners who are not going to like me for this, not at the table, and maybe at the table, but certainly there are others. I understand the costs of parking. Mr. Schroll, I think of in this regard, but I feel that 5D is not consistent with those conversations from this summer, and a conversation that we should continue to have, but in the future.
Thank you. I'll just say that we know that parking is grossly, I'm prepared to support the motion. We know that parking is grossly inefficient. It's incredibly costly. Those are sometimes reflected in attainability in terms of costs and prices, but it's also true that parking in residential neighborhoods also serves an additional role. Homes need to be serviced by vehicles, even if they do not actually own and operate a personal vehicle for everyday use, whether it be through visitors, whether it be through, daily visits by, food delivery companies, or lengthier visits by moving companies. And when we're able to achieve some of our transformative parking reduction policies in planned corridors, it's by virtue of their being able to be the sharing of those spaces among a larger set of units. And that doesn't exist within our districts, and won't exist with the sporadic nature of EHO development. And so the whole idea that we would apply those principles that are really reflective of great policy in areas where we built the infrastructure and have the ability through special exception to ensure that those other needs, those vehicle service needs, are accounted for, I just can't apply those standards here. Just, to me, it's apples and oranges, so I'm happy to support this motion. All right, seeing no further discussion, we'll now vote. You want to?
No.
Okay, so we'll now vote on Mr. Karantonis' motion. All those in favor of removing option D, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it, and option 5D is removed. Any further deletions from 5 that we're pursuing? Ms. Crystal.
So I had been working on a deletion that I'm not actually going to propose, but it was going to be an opportunity to make the following comment, which I'd love to. Apropos of the previous conversation, I am supportive. I will just note, I think it's so important in terms of setting this conversation going forward. We are not debating how much parking will be built with EHOs. We are debating how much government is going to require be built. I think that for so many of the reasons, it feels infeasible to those in our community who live more than 3/4 of a mile away from transit station. It will similarly feel infeasible for future property owners, future property developers, future buyers of VHO forms. And I think that it is not unreasonable to expect that the market is going to deliver an appropriate amount of parking. So I think most colleagues are with me on that. I just think it's really important as we move forward to make sure that we are not talking about how much parking will be built, but how much parking government is going to mandate and in fact going to interrupt the regular flow of commercial decisions to insist upon.
Thank you. Okay, we're now ready to move on to 6, tree requirements. We have already made an addition there. Any deletions that are proposed?
I've got one prepared,
All
Mr.
right, thank
Chair.
you, Ms. Crystal.
I'm going to propose that we strike line 273, which is option 6B, that would place no additional requirements for tree retention or planting. I think, as discussed earlier, there is interest in exploring whether more trees can be established, but I don't think I've heard any interest in whether fewer.
I will second that. Is there any further speaking to that is required? Okay, so let's have a vote on all those in favor of Ms. Crystal's motion to delete option 6B. Say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it. 6B is deleted. We have one option for tree requirements: simplicity and clarity. Look at that. All right. 7, annual limits. We now have worked through and added an option C and amended the text of A. Are there any deletions proposed for this? Ms. Garvey?
Yeah, I haven't actually worked this with anybody, but looking at this, I think I'd like to take option 7B, delete that one, seeing as we've had all of this discussion and come to some agreement, which is talking about doing caps. I'd like to take off the option of not having any limit.
Well, first we need to see if there's a second.
All right, yeah.
There is a second. Okay, we'll now discuss it. Ms. Garvey, anything else to add?
No, not particularly. We've had a lot of discussion. I think we've come to kind of where we want to be for advertising, and I think that includes having some sort of caps. I know it may not be unanimous, but that's useful to do, I think. Again, just to take concern off the table. Thank
I
you.
will just say I'm not sure that I could say that the conversation that we had definitively determined that caps were to be a part of this. It was a conversation about if caps are to be a part of it, what ought it look like? I was fully expecting, just with my conversation, my own personal belief in limits aside, that part of the conversation over the next 2 months should be no caps or caps of this sort. So I just wanted to make sure that I at least characterized my part in the conversation earlier. Ms. Crystal, and then Mr. DeFranco.
Strongly associate myself with that as well. I think have been at this for over 3 years at this point, discussed many of these elements exhaustively. This is an idea that we have been exploring, I think, maybe over the last 6 weeks. So I don't think that it is ripe for decision-making yet.
Mr. DeFranco.
Yeah, I don't support removing 7B. I think I may end up at a cap, but I could envision a scenario where there's sufficient structure of what is accessible under 2E that would lead me to lean more towards that than to any cap, and so I want to keep the option for consideration. I'm glad, though, that we had this brief discussion on it and that you brought it. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, we'll now move to a vote on Ms. Garvey's substitute to, her motion to delete option 7B. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, please say nay. Nay. Motion fails. Do you need to record that, Ms. Jacobs?
No.
All right. We'll now move to number 8. Any deletions to our proposed options A and B? Nine, duplex definition. Options A and B. Deleting any of them? Proposing deleting any of them? Good. 10, applicability to all districts. We have, again, 2 options there, A and B. Should they remain on the table? Any proposed deletions? Moving on, we're almost there, folks. Maximum floor area. It's 11A, B, and C. Any proposed removal of any of those options? Seeing none. 12. Mr. DeFerranti.
I would, after asking questions about it, I think 11C, no limits on gross floor area. I think, Mr. Carantonis, you may have had some concerns there, but I will, for my part, I will offer an amendment to strike no limits 11C.
Okay, so motion, is there a second?
Seconded.
Moved and seconded. Would you like to speak further to it, Mr. DeFerranti?
Certainly, again, appreciate the instinct to allow, to be flexible and the implementation challenges. I do, this is an option that came to us more recently. I feel that the net cost in terms of distraction outweighs the benefit in terms of the potential that I would be at this place. I can't envision voting for 11C ultimately at this stage, and so I think it benefits our conversation to strike it.
Ms. Garvey and
Yeah,
then Mr.
thank you.
Carantonis?
On this one, I am not going to support that. I think I'd like to keep that there to have these discussions about what we want. A lot of it is just looking at what we're going to be creating and concerns about homeownership and what's going to be rental and house sizes are there. So I'd like to leave that in. Thanks.
Thank you. No longer Mr. Carantonis? Okay. Ms. Crystal?
You know, it's interesting. I'm sort of with you on the principle, but the justification is where I get off the wagon, right? Like, again, I think this idea that we can somehow, instead of making good policy, we're trying to, at the stage of RTA, manage the conversation is disappointing to me. Nevertheless, I think you're right that it is a relatively new idea. I think that the notion of managing the overall maximum floor area is the right conversation to be having. It has been part of staff's recommendation from the beginning. To me, it is a question of whether we tailor it. So we're just managing the likelier duplantions rather than all of the units. I don't think there is a universe in which I see myself pursuing no limits at all, particularly on the semi-detached and towns. So I think that I am comfortable, again, trying to arrive at that conclusion based on what I think the likely policy discussions are, rather than this effort to control what people are going to think. I don't know that there's much we can do in that regard. But I do think that is not a policy tool I'm going to find myself wishing I could reach for at the time of March. So I'm happy to support the motion.
Mr. Chair, I would point out that that no colleague has to agree with my reasoning. That's right. Even if we reach the same conclusion.
She's agreeing with you. Take it as a win.
No more comments.
All right, so we'll now, I think everyone has spoken. We'll move to a vote on Mr. DeFerranti's motion to exclude option 11C. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 All those opposed, nay? Nay. Mr. Carantonis, I was not able to.
It's an aye.
You're an aye. So by a vote of 3-2 with Mr. Carantonis, Ms. Crystal, and Mr. DeFerranti concurring, 11C is removed as an option. Okay, we are now to 12, accessory dwellings, where there are two options, A and B. We're good. Okay, hopefully I will get this right. So I'll do the tick-tock of where we are. We're now looking at a main motion, which includes option 1, and then options 2, A, B, C, D, and E. 3A, 4, A and B. 5, A, B, C, and E. 6, A. 7, A, B, and C. 8, A and B. 9, A and B. 10, A and B. 11, A and B. And 12, A and B. Does that comport with what you think, where you think we are? Hopefully? All right, sounds good. All right, so that is now our motion. Do we want to have concluding remarks? I'm sorry, do we want to have concluding remarks on this before we take a vote on the motion as amended? Mr. DeFerranti?
Whatever's a pleasure, but I'll start since I didn't see other red lights, if that works for you, Mr. Chair.
I recognized you. It's yours.
Thank you. I think it's critically important and essential that our residents know that today is not final adoption. I do think there will be people who say that it's final adoption. We're setting the scope, and this is the most that we can enact in March. Some parts of the proposal, we could choose several options. Arlington, I believe, has made two major land use decisions that are relevant. In the 1930s, the county regulated the housing market through the banning of row houses and the banning of non-single-family homes in many places. The purpose was to racially exclude certain individuals and thereby communities. That was not repealed until the late 1960s. The second major decision was late 60s, early 70s to underground the Orange Line and invest in first-generation transit-oriented development. That led to our prosperity in many ways over the last 50 years. Today, we're taking a big next step towards March and towards a significant decision that would refine, and I think it's really important to note, we haven't talked about the general land use plan language, but we're refining our general land use plan, and that shifts us, is a change from a hard and fast sense of we will have density only in the corridors and single-family neighborhoods will be left alone. I don't think that is the right plan for our next years, our next 10, 20, 50 years. That social contract is shifting, and we have to acknowledge that the social contract that we've had has not been as inclusive as it needs to be going forward. My policy goals are the same as they were in the December 2019 and in the scope that we wrote in September 2020. Affordable home ownership, 3 units, type family dwellings, and third, flexibility in housing types and residential uses in single-family neighborhoods. The RTA moves us forward to that goal. I listened to the 171 speakers who have presented over the last week in the 20 sessions and the many organizations that have spoken for and against this. I think that we need to move forward with what we've done. Arlington residents have shared my views in their own words. Laura asked us to move forward in advertising because she wants her kids to have a better chance to live here and believes this is an important part of making that happen. Christine asked us not to proceed unless we are open to the density we approve on our very own streets next to where we live. Nate said this may not do everything, but it is a start at ending what certainly began as exclusionary and continues to make it hard for all to thrive. Meg said, it's just the right thing to do. I agree with her, but what the it is really important, and it's yet to be clearly and fully determined. A former school board member put it the same way. It's worth repeating that this doesn't help those earning less than $100,000 a year, at least initially and for the near term, but it could for the longer term. Ginger shared concerns about eightplexes that align with my thinking. Ultimately, we must move forward with this RTA and work to build consensus. Move forward because my grandparents and my parents benefited from single-family zoning in New Canaan, Connecticut, and Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and the grandparents and parents of many Arlingtonians of color did not. Move forward because there's never a wrong time to do the right thing. Move forward because if you can build a large home on a lot, it is reasonable to be able to build smaller dwellings in the same size building unless there are outside costs or unreasonable burdens to doing so. Missing middle will not fix all our problems or deliver housing that is affordable to every income level, but it will be a critical part in righting the wrongs of the past and providing greater access going forward. The details matter. I'll be into them in the next 2 months. My vote in favor of moving forward is my strong support for an Arlington that is welcoming in its people, diverse in its communities, and has opportunities for people from any and all walks of life. Thanks for tolerating those words.
Thank you. I'll speak to my own view on this. I will vote to move this forward because obviously I believe and have long believed in looking at the way we do residential zoning and not being as exclusionary as we have been under the arbitrary basis of which those exclusions have been imposed. However, I do so deeply disappointed in the advertised ordinance that will go out because I believe we have repeated some of those arbitrary decisions by constricting the advertisement, by offering modifications that were generated from a lot of analysis and thoughtful work to limit those over the next 2 months and not fully consider how they interplay with all of the various options for minimum site area, not to mention the 10 or so other topic areas that we have under our consideration, to me seems like it's going to limit our ability to craft what is the best possible way to move forward with EHO. And so I am disappointed that the limited nature of what will be offered today just doesn't give us the ability over the next 2 months to really do the best policy. And that's a profound disappointment for me, but certainly not disappointing enough for me to vote against it, even though I will repeat again, I'm deeply disappointed with what the main motion looks like. I think that a couple of things that I just want to have us be left with. By taking the 7 and 8 options off the table, we are already yielding to the fact that the most affordable units that could be made available are taken off the table for the biggest lots in Arlington that could accommodate them, limiting the opportunity to further provide attainability through people being able to achieve economies of scale and subsidize on a per unit basis in a very cost efficient way, perhaps as cost effectively as we do with some of the affordable housing contributions that we make on the metro corridors. We don't have the opportunity to explore that over the next 2 months because of the decisions that we're making today. And I think that's a shame because I think our community deserves to hear all of this in its full dynamics and dimensions. But it is what it is. And at the end of the day, what we're going to hopefully move forward with is being able to have all of the requisite pieces to do something that hopefully achieves some of the transformative goals that Mr. DeFerranti so eloquently stated, while at the same time fulfilling our responsibility to deliver for our community a coherent policy where the benefits are clear, the burdens are mitigated or prevented in its entirety, and that this is something that is sustainable for a long time. So I still have a lot of hope, a lot of optimism, tempered with profound disappointment with some significant elements of this, and I'll leave it at that. Ms. Garvey.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So sorry that you're disappointed, but that's kind of the whole nature of what we are doing here. I'm not. I have a goal really all along. Someone said it really well. I took a note. I have to go back to see who it was on, I think, Saturday, saying we should be doing sensible and measured change. And what we're advertising feels to me like sensible and measured change. I want to also not forget to thank everybody who's been involved in this process. And I might start with you, Mr. Chair. This has gone really relatively smoothly, particularly today and the last few days, and that's because of your leadership and a lot of hard work and organization that went on behind, somewhat behind the scenes. It's all transparent. You can ask us, but we've been trying to figure out how best to manage this conversation. And I really, really appreciate the time that you took because it's a lot of time. And I appreciate the time that my colleagues have taken. Staff has done an incredible job. And our residents, everybody who's come and worked this through, and our commissions, it's amazing. I think we are almost to what I think of as the end of the beginning of this process of change in Arlington, which is partly why I'm not so anxious to go so far right away with this. I think this is just a beginning. I want to just say one thing to a few people who have been getting upset, saying that the plan keeps changing. And on the other side, people say, you're not being responsive, you're not listening to us. For at least 18 months, we have been putting out, our staff particularly at first, putting out information, getting feedback, modifying what they do, putting it out again, getting feedback, modifying it. That's what the board's been doing. The reason it's been changing is because we have been listening to people and doing our best to respond and try to make this as good a proposal as we can. And I think we're getting really, really close. So that's why it's been changing, but it's not going to change now until March, till we adopt. So this is what we're really, really going to be talking about in March, and that's clear now, and I appreciate having 2 months to do that rather than the usual just 1 month break. Again, I think we're beginning the process of deciding more clearly what we want. And as I have talked about a bit before, I hope once we adopt something in March, what we do next is going to be really important. And I think there's some really important in-depth conversations about what kind of a community we want. I notice in the staff describing what one of our goals is, we want to have vibrant and sustainable communities in our communities where there are neighborhoods where it's low density. I think we all say we want vibrant and sustainable, but I know one person's vibrant and sustainable is another person's loud, noisy, and uncomfortable changing. So there's a whole conversation that needs to kind of happen. The devil is indeed in the details, and I'm hoping we can have a good community conversation, possibly neighborhood by neighborhood, about what we want moving forward. And that conversation should include all the pressures we're going to be facing from the outside. Because we here in Arlington aren't going to be able to decide just what we want in our neighborhood, in our place, and ignore what's going on around us. And there is a lot, from climate change to politics to economics. I think that's an important conversation. I view what we will pass in March, and as I said, I indicated earlier, I want to have a lot of monitoring, picking up a lot of data about what's actually happening. I've gotten a little tired about warring experts. One expert says this, one expert says that. I mean, we're going to have some real data about what's happening in Arlington, in all of our neighborhoods when we pass this. And I think that can inform the discussion about where we want to be, say, 30, 40 years from now, and what we need to do to get there. So I view this as a really good method to start getting some very good information in. It will continue to be tweaked and changed, and that is going to be good. I think we will have, again, this conversation that will get us to a better place of having a healthier conversation. I am looking forward to that. That's going to be the next step after March. Most of my thinking now actually is going to be focused on how we have those good conversations moving forward, and I think that's going to take a year or two to actually do properly. A lot of people and groups have been coming to me saying, we want to have this conversation. Help. I'm really looking forward to that. I think that's all I feel I need to say now. I do want to take this step because we should not wait to loosen the grip of single-family zoning, this one housing type on most of our county, and we are going to loosen that grip. As disappointed as some of my colleagues may be, this is a big step that we're going to be taking, and I expect us to take in March. But I do think we need to take it somewhat slow as we work out what we want and what we want Arlington to be like in the future. So I really appreciate the time and the effort and the conversations I've had. I'm looking forward to more of them. Thank you. And thank you again, everybody taking us through, and our chair. This has been really good. Thank you.
Remind everybody, we're not done yet. So, a lot of this is sounding like, we're at the concluding stage. We keep your energy, folks. All right, Mr. Karantonis.
Mr. Chair, I have to say that the last year has been an amazing year of public engagement and of hearing literally the voices of thousands of people. And I have to commend everybody who worked on this so far and brought us to this moment, including, and first and foremost, our vice chair today and chair last year, Ms. Crystal, for having advanced this conversation, which is a historic conversation. At the core of that is indeed loosening the grip of exclusionary zoning, reversing the 1938 decision that brought us to this position here, that we face enormous problems with housing, exclusion, and not only that, inequity, exclusion, and also a huge drag on our economy and our possibility to continue to be a successful community in the future. I have to say, Mr. Dorsey, that I perfectly understand the disappointment. And I have wrestled with this decision for months now, whether I could find a way, a pathway of feasibility. I tried many times to see whether we can put conditions on that, find the ways to get affordability in a by right setting. And I just couldn't find a path that would satisfy a pragmatic and a pathway with a pathway to success in the first phase of implementation, the next 5 to 10 years. I'm really focused in getting an ordinance and an amendment, a reform through that has very high likelihood of success and that will be supported by all those who have put so much effort in getting us here, enabled us to do that, either because they voted the right way or because they supported the right causes or because they have added their voice in the community dialogue on that. For me, equity and justice is the first component of all this. I think that we are about to make a very big step forward. I literally haven't heard anybody who would answer affirmatively the question whether, if it was in front of us today, that they would vote for the 1938 resolution to restrict the uses and create exclusive single-family household housing. We are at the point where we have to manage growth in a different way, and I agree with Mr. DeFerranti on that. Smart growth, version 1 has created a very high opportunity community that gave us the ability to grow a very robust economy, gave us the ability to fund our schools, to be a safe community, to have all the attributes that allow, if it were available to everybody, that allow growing and allow growing with inclusion. But Smart Growth 1.0 hasn't provided a viable solution for our housing shortage and our supply woes. Smart Growth version 2 will build upon Smart Growth version 1. What we are trying here is to expand the scope and the benefits of smart growth and to include everybody, to create really opportunity that is available for all. Growth has become really complicated in Arlington, more complex. I shouldn't say complicated, more complex in Arlington. We are responding to that, to these complex challenges with making opportunity available to more people from more walks of life. And in all this, so I really have worked and thought I was focused very much on the environmental benefits of all this. Distributed density is really carbon efficient. It reduces the traditional patterns of traffic, those that have been contributing almost 38% of total carbon emissions. It allows us to use built space more efficiently. It allows us to use public space more efficiently. It allows us to grow transit modes that are way more efficient and serve more people at a lower cost and with a bigger economic benefit. We are making a step forward in improving design and urbanism in Arlington. We know that this 21st century will ask us to build smart growth around not only around a single dominant asset, which is transit, but also around other civic assets like public spaces, like neighborhood retail, like the local neighborhood availability of services. It's healthier, it's human scale. Human scale neighborhoods are healthier to everybody. Kids can play out there, seniors can walk. It brings a critical mass of residents and brings them in proximity to these assets and enables them to enjoy of these assets that will grow because there are enough people there. So the concept of affordability, I'm not going to give up. For me, this is extremely important. And we have Still a lot of way to go. I just wasn't satisfied that with a by right approach, we would get there, especially in the bigger plexes. We still have a lot of conversation to do, and we have so many options on the table to discuss. On the process, I have to say that I do believe that this was it wasn't a perfect process, but it was a very fair process that brought in a lot of different opinions. And I have all the respect for single-family household owners who spoke very, very often, and they were sometimes very, very audible. It's not wrong to be a homeowner in Arlington. It's absolutely not wrong. If somebody believes that because I've been asked that, absolutely not. But also it's not wrong to be a renter in Arlington. It's not, and it shouldn't be wrong to be not a white, upper middle class individual, wealthy enough to afford a runaway, assets in the runaway housing market. This intervention levels the field, creates opportunity, and makes a good step forward in actual good policy. More people means more Arlington. Jane Green said that, and I think this sticks with me because her first article when she first published here in Arlington, when she first arrived here, was, "Am I a burden, myself and my kid?" So the answer to that is no. You are welcome, and we are going to work with you and with everybody to create the conditions so that no Jane Green with a kid, no young family ever considers itself a burden and see no options forward. So I think that this is a good step forward. We have a lot of intensive conversation in the next 45 days or 50 days. And I think that we will have to dig in and get the best outcome out of there for everybody, not only for the few.
Thank you. Ms. Crystal.
So if this had been a normal hearing, we'd be saying thank you to the many people who testified. So I'll say that instead for a matter of record. With a couple of exceptions, I particularly appreciated the civility that was largely on display, and above all, the range and spectrum of opinions. We've heard a couple times people describe this policy as divisive, and I would respectfully challenge that and say what this policy is one that exposes the divisions in our community, exposes the chasm of opportunity and experience by those who are fortunate enough to have already bought in and by those who want that opportunity. A healthy community is one in which all points of view are heard and not wished away or excluded in the name of a consensus that reflects only consensus of like minds. And I am so grateful to those who came forward to represent that full perspective and those full point of views. The point of advertisement is to continue debate and define the terms. After 3 years, hundreds, if not thousands of pages of analysis, engagements of experts in higher education and development and planning and regional growth and housing economics, an intensive commission review of the proposed zoning ordinance amendments. Some might even call them a panel of resident experts from our Planning Commission, from our Transportation Commission, from our Housing Commission, our Joint Facilities Advisory Commission, Forestry and Natural Resources, and Aging Commissions. We have a recommendation in front of us, and I think it is an understatement to say we are ready to continue the debate. Like our chair, I am disappointed that we are moving forward in a way that takes off the table the outcomes of that extensive analysis and substitutes it with measures designed to chase public opinion rather than effectuate the best policy. Moving forward with care does not mean moving forward with timidity. And indeed, to move forward with timidity sows the seeds of this policy's own failure. We say we're concerned about only getting the most expensive forms, or we're concerned about concentrating missing middle in only a few places, or we're concerned about missing opportunities to serve public servants and failing to diversify our neighborhoods. But we are in danger of delivering exactly that outcome by seeding the forms that will achieve affordability, by handicapping missing middle relative to single-family detached, by restricting where it can go. I think that there is a lot of hope left here, and I hope that we can do better over the coming months as we work our way towards a final policy. I want to conclude on a more optimistic note. which is that we have spent exclusively our time today talking about the zoning ordinance amendments. We have not talked much about the other part of the motion, which is the amendments to the draft general land use plan booklet. I want to take a moment to particularly commend our staff. To me, the recommended text amendments are a case study in government taking accountability for the exclusionary consequences of our decisions. There is descriptions of how owning that the exclusionary nature of Arlington's planning vision for the county's residential land outside of the transit corridors has contributed to economic and racial segregation. We have talked a lot about and tried to evaluate this policy, through the lens of it being a policy intervention. I would humbly submit that we're actually doing the inverse. Nearly a century later, we are now evaluating the largest and most restrictive land use intervention in Arlington's policy history, and we are finding it wanting. Or rather, we are finding it worked exactly as it was designed. Because in that same general land use plan, our staff highlighted the history that in the 2 decades following the establishment of zoning in Arlington County, the county experienced a period of tremendous population growth from 26,615 residents in 1930 to 135,449 in 1950. And 97% of the county's growth during that period can be attributed to an increase in white population. We are still living with the legacy of that, although it's not the legacy of that. We are actively perpetuating that every day that we let it stand. 48% of our population in zoning districts that allow 2-family or townhouses or multifamily are people of color, almost half our population. In R5 to R20 districts, only 28% of our residents are people of color. Again, I agree we need to move forward with care, although not timidity. And I would argue that we are well prepared to do so after those 3 years of analysis. But for all of us who desire to live in a community that reflects our professed values, we cannot let this policy intervention, missing middle is not the policy intervention. Zoning, deeply restrictive zoning, is the policy intervention, and we cannot let it, with all of its intended and unintended consequences, continue to stand on our watch. It is time to move forward. We continue to have a path to do so, and I remain optimistic about our remaining weeks of dialogue. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal. Mr. Karen, okay, we're good. Okay, we're now ready to move to a vote on the main motion as significantly amended. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? The ayes have it, 5-0. We now have an advertisement for our consideration over the next 2 months and concluding in March. Colleagues, I would like to make an additional motion, just given our attempt to be orderly and cover all bases today. We may not have in fact done so. So in order to make sure we are perfectly good in the eyes of our public and, of course, most importantly, our county attorney, I'll move that we authorize the county attorney to review all motions passed today and make any necessary and appropriate changes to the zoning text to be advertised to correct scrivener's errors, ensure internal consistency, and update cross-references as needed. Second. It is seconded. I don't think we need to speak to that unless anybody would like to. All those in, Mr. Karantonis?
No, I'm just
all those
preparing
all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it, 5-0. Let me give a note of where we go from here, because this is really the first step to just authorize really what's on the agenda for the actions that we're going to be taking in March. And so from here, our best responsibility is to make sure everyone who has an interest, a stake, and a desire to engage on this issue understands exactly what has been done. So we will be, as soon as is practicable, producing some materials which not only explain what options are in the board's action as of today, but any areas where we can provide supplemental information to better help frame the topic area itself. So we'll be working on those materials over the next however long it takes and make those available as soon as we possibly can. Of course, As soon as staff can do so, some distillation of the actions that we have taken today will be made available for public use, and will also hopefully make it into some form of a press release. And we want to make sure that as early as possible, people can begin to think about the options that are now on the table and engage with each other and with the board in ways that you see fit over the next 60 days approximately. With that, is there any other business that needs to come before the board for our January meetings? Ms. Jacobs?
No, there's not.
Okay. No other business. We are now adjourned. Thank you all. All right.